Welcome back everybody to the next segment in our basement bar build series, where we're going to do an in-depth tutorial of a coffered ceiling with crown molding. As always, if you could hit those like and subscribe buttons, help me keep fresh content coming to you. Hit me up in the comments if there's something you want to see or you have questions, and hope you enjoy. Bye.
Our next step in the build here is going to be to start the coffered ceiling. Really excited to start this step. It's going to look really great when it's done. It's just going to take this project to the next level. The bar and what we have envisioned for that is already going to be next level. The coffered ceiling is just going to be one more thing. It's just going to set this over the top, push it past any of our normal basement bar builds or our basement renos. A couple things we'll go over before I actually get into showing you the layout and how we mark our chalk lines and all that. Talking about our chalk lines. Got my chalk line in my bag here. This one I have set up for red chalk. The red chalk tends to be a more permanent marking type chalk. It's very hard to get off. If you see, I was using some of this earlier to start some mark out on camera, and I have some remnants of red in my shirt. And if you look in front of me here, there's actually some remnants of red chalk on the carpet here. And that's after I went through and vacuumed everything up, right? Because if you don't do that, it gets on your shoes, you track it everywhere. You'll track it through the customer's house. The point I'm trying to make here is this stuff will stain, and it's probably not going to come out if you get it on a rug or something. So I know that this rug is coming up and we're going to replace the floor down here, so I'm a little less cautious on what gets spilled on it. If this was an add-on design of an already built house and we had a finished floor and finished walls, I certainly would not be using the red chalk to go ahead and get the blue, just because it stains a lot less and it cleans up a whole lot easier. As we get into the bones of how we're going to do this here, like most things in finished carpentry, layout and design is your most important. So you may have seen in previous video segments, and you'll see a little bit in the next one, I'm showing you how to do this. I actually had our coffering portions marked out with blue painter's tape on the ceiling. That way I could look at it and visualize how our final product was going to look, and the customer could see it too, and we can make some adjustments from there. After that, I took a lot of careful measurements, I took them and I retook them again. After I had my measurements and had a pretty good idea of where we wanted our coffering sections to go, then I drew a schematic so I can know exactly where my measurements are left and right, and it just makes it that much easier on the layout. I'll go ahead and I'll see if I can get a picture or a video of that actual drawing and embed it into the video. Moving forward, as we get into the bones in this and how we do our layout and get our anchoring in, and then follow that by the wood planks in our crown molding, I want to talk a little bit about letting the wood acclimate. So down alongside me here you can see we have all of our coffering boards as well as our crown molding. That's been sitting in this house for about a week. Generally, whenever you're doing some sort of finished carpentry like that, or you're doing some sort of trim molding, you want to let it sit in the house for a good 3 to 5 days. I personally prefer at least a week, and that's to let it acclimate to the moisture levels. If we were to take this molding here and take it right from the supply shop and install it for our final carpentry project, what would happen is anywhere within like 2 days to probably 2 to 6 months, depending on the seasons, because that is going to have a different moisture level in it, it's going to actually go ahead and contract significantly more than it would during the normal contraction and expansion phases with the changes of the seasons. So when we install it today with our tight-fitting seams, when it actually contracts, those tight-fitting seams are going to open up, and it's going to be, one, it's going to look horrible, two, it's going to be a callback. There's a couple different, if you search YouTube, you'll actually see a couple different videos like that from other carpenters that actually will show we didn't let this acclimate, and now we have to tear everything out and redo it. So that's one of the reasons why I'm very OCD when it comes to letting your wood acclimate to the content of the house, and I always want to give it at least a week. That acclimation process applies to anything when you're talking about trim carpentry, right? If you're doing window casings, if you're doing a shiplap wall, if you're doing a coffered ceiling with crown molding like we are today, you have to let it acclimate to the moisture content in the house. I cannot stress that enough. Talking about our product, what we have here, we have a couple of different things. We have some 1x4 boards, and we have some standard crown molding. And what we're going to do to anchor those is we're going to use these blocks here, and you can see over behind me I have a bunch of them cut up. After this I'll show you how I measure everything out, and then we snap some chalk lines, and we get everything good for our blocking, and then we'll attach our coffering sections to our blocking here. I'm sure a lot of you are probably thinking right now, why am I doing shorter sections of blocking and snapping chalk lines and going to line everything up instead of just doing full-on sections of 2x4? I can probably get the entire width, the width of the room with one, and then the length of the room in two. Excellent question. There's a reason for that. We talked in the earlier framing segments how our full-on boards always have what's called the crown, right? They have that curve in the board. This is a premium board, so it's not too exaggerated, but the camera's not going to show it, but if you look close down the edge of this board, it actually has a curve to it, right? I'm exaggerating that. If we were to take the full-on 8 foot, 10 foot, 12 foot boards, whatever we have, and run them down the length and the width, that curve is going to show in the Coffered sections. It's not going to be 100% straight, it's going to have the curve of the board. And then if we do have to do a couple boards, specifically talking about the length of the room, it's going to be wavy like an S kind of thing. I don't want that. So by taking the blocking and cutting it shorter, we eliminate that crown in the board and we can get a nice straight run down and across. When you're talking about the Coffered ceiling design, the possibilities really are endless, right? And you can get pretty in-depth in things here, especially when you have super high ceilings. Here we're just going to do a basic 4-inch lumber design, right? I'm going to use the 2x4s for the bracing, and we're going to do a 4-inch beam followed by standard crown molding. You can get really in-depth with kind of your 3D effects of this, right? We could do an 8-inch width and do an 8-inch beam, and then do like a box surround coming down, and then do a smaller box and give it like a step 3D effect, and then do crown molding. We're not going to do that here. One, it's just not really the design we're going for. The other is the height of the ceiling, right? The more in depth you make it, you kind of have to bring your beam a little bit lower most times, right? Here we just have a standard height basement ceiling. There's really not a whole lot to work with. The other thing to consider here is we have our in-ceiling speakers. The more we actually build up around those speakers, the less the sound can travel to the ideal user listening position. So we don't want to obstruct that in any way.
As we move forward here, you'll see I'm doing a couple things with marking on the ceiling. The first thing you see me doing there is I'm using the stud finder to mark the joist locations in the ceiling. I want to go ahead and mark those and use the actual joist as anchor points wherever I can. The other thing I'm doing is I'm measuring, remeasuring, and then measuring again to mark our layout for where I want the box beams and the blocking in the ceiling to go. And you'll actually see after I do this chalk line right here, I actually snap another one 3/4 of an inch next to it. I screwed up that first one. I had my measurement off by 3/4 of an inch, which is the width of one of those dimensional lumber boards we're using. And I just had to do another one next to it. So like I always say, slow things down, take your time, try and do it right the first time. Fortunately, I did that, slowed things down, took another look at it, something just didn't seem right, and realized I was off just a little bit.
So what I'm going to do really quick for just all of these spots we're going to put the bracing is I'm just going to mark the center where the joists are, and I'll just take the level and the pencil and just get a rough mark. So when I'm drilling in, I know I'm in the center of the joist or close to it. As I set my blocking up here, I don't know if you can see that on camera or not, but I did pre-drill those just with a drill and a countersink, just a very slight countersink. This blocking is going to be what's holding the entire system up. I don't want to run into any situations where I split the wood and didn't realize it, so I'm just going to pre-drill to alleviate that. An extra step, but a safety step. A couple other tidbits of information here. Talking about pre-drilling. Aside from splitting the wood, one of the other reasons I pre-drill is it gives me better feedback when I'm working overhead that I'm actually getting my blocking into a joist, right? If I don't pre-drill that and I feel like I'm torquing through wood, it could just be the block. I could be missing the overhead. So by pre-drilling, I just get that feedback knowing that it's going solidly into that joist. And if you notice, I'm using a drill driver, not really an impact. So again, just one of those things for tactile feedback. Next thing is, it's not showing on camera frame right now, but as you see I'm walking back, we'll probably get it in a later segment, I'm actually working on a platform right now, not just a ladder, so it gives me just a little more room to go back and forth and get my blocking on. Platforms can be dangerous if you're walking on them, because you can think you're standing on something solid, right, and you're not paying attention, and next thing you know you step and you fall off. A lot of injuries happen that way. So when you're working on a platform, as always, safety is paramount. Every step you take, you have to be cognizant of where you are and look before you take another step. What I'll often do is when I get to an edge, I'll anchor my foot there, and in my mind, I'll just think to myself, that foot does not move until you look where you're going the next step. All right, gang, talking about this cross intersection here where we have the intersection of the lengthwise beam and the widthwise beam. And I feel bad, I'm giving you all these little tidbits of do this, do that, all these little minute details. There's a lot rolling around up here. I haven't been doing this for as long as I have. So I'm trying to give you as much information as I can from my head on how I like to do it the best and how it stays the most structurally sound and how I just like doing it with the best finished product. At the end of the day, as long as you have things anchored solid into your joists, you're going to be good to go, right? So you don't have to be like out there with a pencil and paper, but he said to do it like this. As long as you're in with your blocking, you're going to be good to go. With that being said, a couple caveats to that. The other thing I do just want to revisit is how I said I'm doing the shorter blocking instead of just the longer boards because I'm worried about the crown. Most oftentimes when you're doing a coffered ceiling, they're much shorter boxes, so to speak, right? They're going to usually be between 3 to 4 feet. And realistically, anything 5 feet and under, even with the crown, it's probably not going to show, right? I've just elected this method. I'm committed. I'm doing it like this. Anything 6 feet and over for a box, I definitely would not do as a solid board. Anything 6 feet and over, I would go ahead and break up into the blocking like I'm doing now and just get it on that chalk line. So the big reason I'm doing the blocking, I just kind of committed it for the shorter sections, is for the longer sections, right? When we talk about the longer section that I have, specifically the middle 2 boxes in this design, they're going to be upwards of, I think at this point, 9.5, somewhere between 9.5 to 10 feet. So if I do that with dimensional lumber, that crown is definitely going to show, right? That's pretty much, for the most part, the litmus test on why I'm doing this blocking process. And this part is really important. A few seconds earlier I talked about, it doesn't really matter overtly, just get the wood up there and get it drilled solidly into the joist and you're good. But think about the human eyes, right, and the visual element when you enter a room. When you enter a room and you look down, long ways is where you see the seams and the gaps, right? So if I do a block here, and then I do a separate block here, even if those are off by like 1/16 of an inch, it might look a little bit wavy, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we do the boxes and we do the crown molding and how to hide the seams the best. But again, looking as an end consumer walking into a room, what do you visually look at? You look at things downrange, long. So here, where I have this intersection, I want to make sure I have the same piece of blocking on this coffering block to this coffering block so that it doesn't look offset by any stretch of the imagination. And as we're doing the lengthwise beam, our tactics change a little bit. The other ones, I have the length of the joist running down, so I'm just screwing into that. As we go down the lengthwise beam, I'm hitting the joist every 16 inches. So I want to make sure to hit the joist before and after where our intersection is to make sure we're nice and solid. It'll make sense when you're doing it, I promise. The next step is to start measuring our 1x4s for the box frames we're going to do in each of these sections. And again, I talked earlier, you can kind of use any size, right? I'm just using the 1x4 dimensions because it's just going to give us a nice look, right? It's not going to bring our depth too deep, it'll give us a nice symmetrical beam. You could go deeper, you could do 1x6, 1x8, either for your depth or for your width. The possibilities are endless. I talked a few minutes earlier about the human eyes and how when you enter a room, they're drawn to the length of the room for the visual focus, right? So we want to play that into our design here for our boxes and where we hide our seams. And this always goes true again for anything, whether we're doing coffered ceilings, crown molding, whatever. You want to hide your seams on the long axis of the room and where things are being viewed. Or not necessarily the long axis, but where the human eyes are looking at, right? So our entrance is on the other end. So as people come down the stairs and enter into the basement, they're going to be focused on this section, right, looking towards my direction. So as we do our box here, we have to figure out where we want to hide our seams. We absolutely could miter them. That's not really the design I'm going for here, or I think what's going to be the best build, right? A lot of times when I'm doing smaller coffering sections, 3 feet by 3 feet, I'll just pre-assemble the box. But if I do that here, that's just going to be kind of wobbly and there's a pretty big margin for error. So I'm just going to do one piece at a time, and when we do these, we want to do we'll call them the width pieces first, right? Because the room is wide this way, long that way, length, width, yeah. We do our box build here, we want to take that visual perspective into account, right? People are looking down the room this way towards my direction. So they're going to be looking at the seams and the corners here, right? As we build our box, we can take that into account to try and hide those joints a little bit better. By doing the width pieces, so to speak, first, right? When I do my length piece, they're going to come together like this. They're going to come together like this. And I don't know if the camera's showing that or if I can zoom in on that on editing, but it will show on the final product. It's going to help hide that seam, right? It's going to help hide that joint. If we were to go the other way around and do the length pieces first and the width one second, they're going to come together like that, and that joint and that gap is just going to be that much more pronounced. Yes, we're going to caulk everything. You probably wouldn't see it anyway, but it's just one more step to build things a little bit better and be a little more visually appealing. My next step is for all these width pieces. I'm going to measure them, cut them, and we'll get them tacked up into place. Working here on my 10-inch miter saw, I actually brought this inside and just set it up in the area where I'm working. I do have a 12-inch miter saw that I use most of the time, but that generally stays outside on the job site I'm working on. It's a bigger, heavier saw, and it's on a wheels base. So it's portable in the fact that I can pull it off of my truck or trailer and wheel it around the job site wherever it needs to go. But it's difficult to get inside, up, and downstairs. I have the 10-inch setup that I really like. I am a little bit limited when it comes to the bigger projects just because I can only cut so much depth of wood on it, but for 90% of the time this works just fine. It's only when I'm dealing with a lot bigger window and door casings and a lot bigger crown molding that this just doesn't quite cut it, and then I'll either bring the 12-inch in or I'll just work outside. But in this case here, it's small enough, it's light enough, it's easy enough to just bring in and out, and I have the foldable stand. It compacts down pretty nice. Just so much easier when I'm doing these bigger projects and I have a lot of cuts to make. Here I have just 6 feet of the board I'm going to use. Before I brought them into the project space, they come in 12-foot bundles. A couple of them that I knew I was only going to need the 6 feet on, and by a couple actually I think it's most of them, I just chopped in half. That way it's easier to bring down the stairs. I'm not trying to maneuver a bundle of 12-footers. I can just do a bundle of 6-footers. It makes it a whole lot easier. For my blade on this, I'm using a precision trim blade. It's a 90 tooth. It just gives a lot smoother cuts. It's not so much with this portion, but when I'm doing the crown molding and I'm actually coping the corners, it makes it a lot easier and it just gives me such a smoother finish. When I'm doing my framing, for the most part my 12-inch saw that I have set up outside, that's most of my framing wood and all that. I'll just do a rough cut framing blade on that, but if I am doing something as far as cutting bigger crown molding, I will swap the blade out. That's one of the other reasons I like to use this saw. I keep this set up, for the most part, with just that 90 tooth fine finish blade on it. That way I don't have to keep switching blades out, right? My 12-inch saw is set up for framing rougher, bigger cuts. This is set up more for precision and fine cuts. Before I go firing nails into here, using this as a backstop, assuming that there's a piece of framing back here, I do just want to check that with my awl. I'm just going to jam that into the wall and make sure. Logic would dictate with framing and drywall, there would be a cross member back here, but I've seen stranger things where there isn't. Let's just find that out. So I'm glad I checked that because there is some framing behind here, but it's really limited to about the first 1 inch down. After that is just drywall space. So I'll make sure to get a good row of nails up top. I'm really not too concerned about anchoring the bottom in because once I get our side lengthwise pieces in, that will hold everything flush to the wall. And by the time we do our finished caulking, you'll never see that. If I was really worried about it, I would just use some construction adhesive on the board, or I would fire in some wall anchors. If you see the gap here, that's normal, right? Don't worry about that. That's why we're going to do the crown molding and hide that. If we weren't doing that, we would just use some caulk. But that's normal, right? We talk about the drywall, how you're always going to have those waves, and that's why you have a good finisher. Same concept with the ceiling here. For this, I'm just using my 15 gauge nailer. Definitely don't want to use 18 for this. 18 is going to be too small. 18 is normally really good for trim, but in something like this where you have the box frames going in and then the crown molding, I want that heavy duty 15 gauge nail with substantial holding power and shear strength to hold this entire assembly up. Probably could get away with a 16 gauge nailer, do a little bit smaller nail holes, but at the end of the day, The 15 gauge really aren't that much bigger to fill. I have to fill a nail hole anyway. And the 15 gauge just has better holding power, both for holding it to the wall and for the shear strength of stopping it from dropping down. I have this much lumber and this much molding in these sections. I want a heavy duty nail in there. This is something, if I didn't have the saw set up right here, I would actually go ahead and I would just take all these measurements, write them down on a pad, and come back and redo it, or especially if I was on like scaffolding or a ladder. But I have my saw set up right here, everything is close enough. I'm just going to do an individual board at a time. But if you're constantly going up and down stairs, it's best just to write all your measurements down, cut them at your cut location, and then come in to make your adjustments from there. This is something I like to do when I'm doing the coffered ceilings with this design, where they have the bigger sections, so to speak. A lot of times when you're doing the coffered ceilings, they just have little 3-foot squares in them. If that's the case, I'm just going to build the box on the ground, glue it and nail it, and then just get that up into sections and just tack it into the blocking that's up overhead. When you have the bigger sections like this, it's kind of hard to build them on the ground because they just get all wavy when you go to put them up onto the ceiling. In this situation here, where we're building this as we go, and we're doing the boxes on the ceiling, we want to make sure everything is nice and square. So I was really careful with the first section I did to make sure all my measurements were on point. But now as we go and we do our boxes the rest of the way down, we are going to run into a little bit of a problem where the beams are going to not necessarily be 100% square through the ceiling. That hopefully makes sense with all the things we've talked about in the series, where things are very rarely square to each other, right? Drywall is not an exact thing. You get it close enough and then the paper finishes. When you're doing framing, you have twists and bows and crowns and all that stuff in your lumber. So if you're doing things like this, like finished carpentry or the drywall, going back a few segments, if you think it's going to be 100% square, you're mistaken. You have to be ready to work around that. So in this case here, we have our first segment, which I know is square. And then we have our next sections, which are going to be a little bit off. And if I went ahead and measured, we would be okay, right? It would be close enough. It would be within tolerance, especially once we do the trim and the caulk. But if you watch this channel and you know anything about me building, good enough is generally not good enough for me. I try and make it as perfect as I can going into the final product. So I know this first box that we did is square. So what I want to do is just take a scrap board and then get it into our beam section here and make this other beam square, and then I'll do the other one that's behind me, and that way when I'm doing my measurement for my next beams going down, I know that they're about as perfect as can be, and it's less caulk we have to use in the end, and it's tighter seams. Don't even have to clamp that, it's pretty tight. Now if I were to take my square and check that on each side, it's pretty darn close. Hey gang, so as is probably evident by my taking the sweatshirt off, I got a little overheated because this corner is giving me a heck of a time. This four-way intersection, so to speak, is just the perfect storm of things not being square, right? Because I'm in the center of the room, I'm in the center of kind of where the joists go overhead, and nothing's really lining up with my vertical and horizontal planes, or 90-degree planes, so to speak. This happens, right, when you're doing these where you're building things on the ceiling as you go, and you can't do them on the floor and line up your edges perfectly. That's bound to happen. No big deal. What I'm going to do is just about 2 feet over from each edge, I'm just going to leave these unnailed. That way, when I do the bottom part of my beams here and I start nailing those in, those will be perfectly square along the contour of the board, and then I'll just take the edges of my boards here, line them up, and nail them in. Inevitably, when you're doing things and you're building on the ceiling like this instead of building on the ground and making your boxes perfectly square, you're going to have those little variances. Usually they're only about a 32nd of an inch. Not a big deal. You just take those and sand those down and make them even. But these are a little bigger. These are about a 16th to, if I go a quarter, maybe 3/16 of an inch. So in that case there, when you sand those down and you do your reveal for the bottom of the beam, it's just going to look off. So I'm just going to leave those unnailed. When we do the bottom of our beams in here, that will lock everything in perfectly square. And then I'll just go ahead and I'll just take a single nail or two on the edges here, lock everything in, and we'll be good to go. I've gone about as far as I can go building these beams up into the ceiling. The last ones I have to do are at the end of the line here. They go along the staircase. So those are pretty much dependent on having my final beam insets here on the horizontal and vertical sections, or whatever you want to call them. So that's going to be the next step I'm going to do, is to actually put those bottoms of the beams in and get my reveal set, square everything up. That way I can do the back end against the wall and we can get started on our crown. Remember we talked before about visualization of the room and looking downrange on the room and trying to keep the lines very long, right? And especially when we're doing our seams, we want to look at the long way of the room and then do our seams accordingly. So when we're talking our center beam here, we're going to want to keep that as long as possible. So if you notice, I have an intersection right here. At this intersection, I'm going to want to go the long way down through that and then do my horizontal sections butting up here to that center section. If I were to go the other way around, things would be very jagged, like a zigzag, as you're looking down the room. No matter what, it's never going to be like 100%. You're always going to have some sort of seam somewhere. But I'm going to show you a few tricks on how we can do some blocking and kind of nail things in there to make it look very seamless, and it'll be good for years to come. Our next step here is going to be to determine what the reveal is going to be. So reveal is just a fancy term for how much wood is going to show underneath, right? So whether you're talking window casings or door casings, or here on our coffer ceilings doing the beam, the reveal is just how much wood is actually just going to show and peek through, and how much inset you have on that finished piece of wood. A lot of that is personal preference, right? Some people like a 1/4 inch, some an 1/8, some in between. A lot of that depends on your design, right? Here we have a pretty narrow beam. So the deeper reveal I'm going to have, the more dramatic it's going to be. And then no matter what, whether how wide your beam is, the shallower your reveal, the less dramatic it's going to be. So if I had a very wide beam here, I might go for a little more dramatic reveal, because more of this structure underneath is going to show. So if I was doing like, let's say an 8-inch beam, I would probably do a 1/2 inch reveal. For this design here, I think that's going to be a little too dramatic, and I'm going to go for 1/4 inch. Again, a lot of that is just personal preference. In this case here, I actually just put a couple together and I did a couple random reveals. I did an A 3/16 and 1/4 inch and just tacked them together just to show the customer what it would look like, and they agreed that a 1/4 inch reveal would be best. So I have my carpenter square here. I have it set to a 1/4 inch. I'm just going to put it on the inside of the beam here, and then I'm just going to go down the line and just give little tick marks marking that 1/4 inch. Then I'm going to take my center sections, and I'm just going to go down, hold them true to that 1/4 inch mark, fire in nails from each side periodically down the way, and we're going to be good to go. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set my miter saw for a 45, and that's going to be the end of what's called a scarf joint. And basically what that is that's a 45 and then an opposing 45, and then we're going to lay these flat together with some blocking behind, and I'll tack it in, and then I can sand it nice and smooth. That's going to be for one of the bottom sections of the beams. You see that a lot in any type of molding where you just run out of room, right? We have a 20-foot run. The longest you're really going to find in molding is going to be 16. So here we have two 12s we're going to join together in the middle. So what you do is you do what's called the scarf joint. And again, that's just the 45, and it lets you sand it nice and smooth together, put some blocking behind, glue and nail everything together. It's going to be really strong, really smooth for a long time. If you just do what's called a butt joint and you leave it flat on the edge, within a matter of days, that's just going to start to show. It's going to edge out on either side. It's going to look like crap, and you're going to see it.
Let's talk for a bit about that scarf joint that's going to go on the end of the board on the left side of the screen there. When I'm going to do a scarf joint, I will only do it if I can get behind the board and get blocking in behind both pieces that I'm going to join together at that joint. That way I can kind of nail that in place, get glue on everything, get glue on the backer board, glue everything nice and snug. If I can't do that, I won't do the scarf joint because the end grain can tend to separate. I mentioned not to use a butt joint because it can separate on you. That's not necessarily true. I use butt joints a lot, but you've got to use special tools for it. Make sure you're using a biscuit cutter or dialing jig or something of the sort to make sure that you're actually mechanically joining those two ends together, or they will tend to separate on you.
I'm just taking a piece of blocking and I'm putting it over my underside of the beam here. This way when I do the intersecting cross members, I can actually tack them up into the blocking. This is going to get glued in and nailed in, and then everything will kind of be like one structural member, and hopefully when the house has its little shifts and stuff and we have the expansion and contraction of the wood during the season changes, everything should stay kind of one structural member here. I'll sand it all down. The joint should disappear for a long, long time. So I just double check my reveal. I have that all set. I did on this side. On this other side, I'm just going to fire in a few nails really close to where this joint is. Then I'm going to shim in this block overhead, bring everything into one. Remember we talked about how ceiling joist walls, they're always a little bit wavy, right? So when you're doing trim like this, it's never on 100%. There's always little odds and ends in the corners there, and you generally cover that with trim and then caulk and you never see it. In this case here, I've got about 1/8 of an inch gap at the end here caused by that waviness in the ceiling. So I can have this end tight, but this end is going to give me about 1/8 of an inch gap. That's not necessarily something that I can go ahead and hide. So what I'm going to do is I just marked out the section here where the ceiling bows down. And I'm just going to cut out that section. That's going to be able to preserve the ends so that I can nail those through the wall into the framing behind. And then I still have my framing in the bulkhead here. I can still get some good nail contact.
Just a quick point to make here, because I can hear the keyboard warriors in the comment section already. Normally what I would do is if this was like floor trim or something finished, I would do a scribe on it and get a nice even line. But because it's just a rough cut on that, now it's going to be covered by crown, I just did that rough cut just to get it up in place. Here I'm just mending board 1 to board 2 at that scarf joint. That's where I was talking. The two boards meet together on that 45-degree angle. I'll go ahead and glue those in together and make sure it's nice and tight. Then I'll sand it to blend in the seam so you never see it. Also of note with that scarf joint is there is a piece of backer board in there that was glued and nailed in behind board 1, and then board number 2 where they meet together at the 45 also gets glued and nailed together. That way they're kind of one full seamless piece, and you can sand everything nice and smooth, and they should all move together in the future. You can see here where these boards meet at that kind of that cross or that plus. That's an excellent example where I have that backer board up there. It's glued and nailed in, and then all three pieces kind of come together. So hopefully they're all held together and blocked in there nice and tight for the foreseeable future. You'll see here on that left side of the board, I did have to notch that out as well to make room for that uneven ceiling and make sure everything fit in nice and tight. Common problem, it happens.
Now that we have our box beams done, we can go ahead and get started on our crown molding. A lot of people can get very intimidated by the crown molding. Do me a favor and don't, right? Just hold on for the ride, stick with me through the segment. I'll show you all the little tricks along the way to go ahead and just get perfect joints and seamless crown molding. The same thing rings true with crown molding when we talk about figuring the long way of the room or what people are looking down at, right? So the same concept we did with our box beams here, when we're doing this, we want to figure out the long axis of the room and what people are looking down, and that's going to be our non-mitered pieces, or our flat pieces, so to speak. Those are really simple, right? Because we're just going to take those from end to end on the box beam. There's no mitering, there's no coping, it's just measurement to measurement, flat cut, nail that bad boy up there. I'll do some blocking up behind here to just go ahead and hold our profile of the trim in on the upper edge. The bottom edge you don't have to worry about because you're nailing into this box beam right here. Bear with me here. We have our box beams built, and I'm just going to go ahead and do the flat cuts, the ones without a miter, off those horizontal, so to speak, right? The ones that are on that horizontal plane of how we're viewing. And then after that, I'll go ahead and I'll show you how we're going to do our miter cuts and our coping on those miter cuts to get those to sit nice and flush in and almost kind of hide that joint as you're looking that long way down the room. Again, bear with me, I got a few tips and tricks to show you. Don't be intimidated, just take it one step at a time. One of the first things we're going to do is just go ahead and put our piece of crown up here. I just have a little scrap piece right here. And because we have it cut on the edges here, I can check the edges and make sure that they're flushing against our trim and flushing against the ceiling. And I can just trace out those lines. And I'll do those in some periodic spots. You know, I'll definitely do them on the edges, one in the center, and then one in between the center and the edges. And by doing that, that takes all the guesswork out of knowing if my pieces are flush, right? I've already traced out where they need to go. So now, when I can't see inside, right, because I'm going to have that full-on piece, I have it traced out, and there's no guesswork. I know that I'm going to be flush against my box and flush against the ceiling. And remember, this is all going to get caulked and painted. So I'm really not worried about making any marks, right? I don't know if that's showing on camera or not, but when I have my piece, I had that bottom line of nails where I was doing the box beams in. Most of those bottom nails I should have put high enough so that the bottom of the crown covers it, so I don't even have to cover most of those nail holes. Should only be having to cover the crown molding trim holes. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this blocking piece that I had made from some of that scrap lumber, some of the scrap I had from doing the frames here. I just took them to my table saw, I ripped them down to 1.5 inches, and I'm just going to tack those into the wood behind. That way when I do the crown, it'll give me some backing to nail into. You don't necessarily have to go crazy with this. I just have my own method. You can rip down strips of plywood, you can rip down strips of the scrap wood, and this actually has the dimensions of actual 3/4 inch by 1.5 inches. If you get 1x2s in the store, you can actually just go ahead and do the blocking that way. It doesn't have to be great wood. You're just looking for something for some backing to nail into. What's also nice is I have my studs marked down here, so I can nail all the way through these and make sure I'm getting right into the studs. Make sure we have some nice strong backing here. So when I'm nailing my crown, I like to nail it in two very distinct places. First is on that lower profile, you have this flat part right here. I'd like to take that straight square in. And then up top here, you have this rounded part in the profile. I like to get through that and into the blocking. A lot of people like to go straight on up here. I don't like that for a couple reasons. One, it's very close to the edge, so you have a tendency to split the board. The other reason is this top curve right here. I just find that when I fill those nail holes in and I sand them down nice and smooth, the way the light reflects and the way just things look in a room, those nail holes hide almost perfectly. If you never knew they were there, you would never see them.
Now I'm just using my nail set, and I'm just setting any nails that might be a little bit too proud, just setting those just below the surface. You see I have the spring style nail set there. I really like that. You just put one end on, you pull back on the spring, and it snaps the nail right below the surface. When it comes to when I set my nails, it's just all situationally dependent on how I'm feeling that day. Some days I'm really in a groove with nailing the boards, and I'll nail my boards in, and then I'll follow behind, and I'll nail set all of them at the end. Sometimes as I'm just going along, I need a little break, and I'll throw the nailer down, and I'll set the nails as I go.
And just a little flimsy part there, just some of the angles weren't lining fully up, so I just put another nail in there just to tack it in. That's one of the reasons I like to do that full strip of blocking. A lot of people will just do a couple pieces along the way and mark where it is, but I like the flexibility of not having to guess where my nail's going and just put one where I need one if something looks loose. I'm going to go ahead and get the rest of these flat pieces in, and remember, there's no, I call them flat, right? I don't know if that's really a standard term, that's my own term. But I call them flat pieces because the ends are flat. There's no miters on them. I'm going to get the rest of those in, and then we'll do our coped ends, and I'll show you how we deal with all that when we get there. We're at the point in our project now where we have those horizontal pieces of crown molding up, or as I like to call them, the horizontal pieces. The next one is to do what I refer to as the vertical pieces, or those ones on the long axis of the room. So we have the horizontal pieces up, which is straight butt ends on the miters, and then on those long axis pieces, we're going to go ahead and cope those joints. And I'll show you how to do that in a few minutes, and I'll show you a few little tips and tricks of the trade to get you a nice smooth finish on those. So you really kind of almost don't need any caulk. I mean, we'll still caulk it to make everything look seamless. But if you do it right and you do your joints right, you really won't even notice that there's a gap there. It'll take some practice. If it's your first time doing it, don't get frustrated. When you're doing this stuff with the crown, especially if it's your first time, go ahead and order a little bit more on the materials. Normally we figure about 10 to 15% extra materials for waste. If it's your first time ever doing crown molding, and I may have mentioned this in a previous segment, if it's your first time doing crown molding, maybe order an extra 20 or 30%, because inevitably you're going to mess it up. With that being said, what I'm going to do is each of these boxes, more so the front two and the back two, I'm going to mark them which ones are the longest and which ones are the shortest. I know that my center sections here, those are going to be longer altogether, so I'm not even going to mark those. But with the forward two and the back two, what I want to do is mark those and kind of do them in reverse order and do the longer ones first and then do the shorter ones last. And my theory behind that is if I cut a piece too long, we can always trim it down, right? But if I cut it too short, well, that's now a waste piece. I can't magically make that longer and defy the laws of physics. So what I like to do is I like to do the sections that are longer first. That way if I accidentally cut that too short, trying to make everything line up perfect, I can go to one of those shorter lengths and not have the waste piece of wood. And when we're talking those measurements, they shouldn't really be that significant, right? Because we tried to do everything so it was perfectly symmetrical. But with that being said, you're still going to have those little variances, right? This length here might be 1/4 of an inch longer than that length on the other side. So I just want to go ahead and just take those little fine measurements. That way we can reduce our waste. So I like doing that, measuring each length before I go ahead and start cutting, and that does two things. You know, we had just talked about it, lets me prioritize which ones I'm going to do first, right? And I'll start with the longer pieces, and then I'll work down to my shorter cuts. That way if I undercut one, I can just go ahead and nibble a little bit off for a later cut. The other thing that does is now all my measurements are done, right? I don't have to keep measuring each individual one. I measured what the cut is, and then I can just start cutting and get to work. And a lot of them are the same, because we planned it out to hopefully be symmetrical, so I can cut a couple pieces at once and get to work. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and do my layout again with my scrap piece and where I want my edges to be. Now I'm only going to do it for the center sections, right? Probably for the shorter sections, I'll just do the center. For these, I'll do one probably at 1/3 and 2/3 distance. I don't need to mark them where my coping joints are going to meet in the corners because they're already set up there, right? I already have those pieces set. So when the molding comes together, when I have my coping curve in there, it's all just going to sit in with that profile of the molding. Right off the bat, I'm just going to go ahead and cut 3 feet off the board. My measurement is just under 9 feet. It's 8 feet, 10 and 1/16 of an inch. So that's about 3 feet of board that I don't need to be messing around with. So you'll see when I'm holding this up against the fence and all that, you have to be pretty precise. So you wouldn't think it, but an extra 3 feet of board on there really does have a lot kind of kicking that board around as it wobbles on the end. So I'm just going to go ahead and chop that off because I don't need it anyway. When you're talking cutting crown, there's several different ways you can do it, right? Like most things in the building trades, there's no one-size-fits-all method, right? And everyone kind of has their own methods they swear by. I have my own little tidbits that I'll impart on you that I found have worked well for me over the years. It doesn't mean it's gospel, right? As always, there's a couple different ways you can do things. If you watch another video and you adopt somebody else's method, no harm on my end. When you're talking trim work and molding, there's 2 types of corners. You have inside corners and outside corners. More specifically, when you're talking crown, you definitely have inside corners and outside corners. So an inside corner is when the face ends of 2 pieces of molding meet together for a corner or for a miter joint. An outside corner is the opposite. Those are when the back ends of 2 pieces of molding meet together for a miter joint. When you're doing outside corners, you can just go ahead and straight miter those for a 45 or whatever the angle is that you figure out with your trim angle gauge, right? You can just do a straight miter on those. That's the best way to do them. Do a little glue, some pins, and nail them together. And I think we'll probably have at least one outside corner. I'll show you how I do a return on that. When you're doing inside corners, things get a little bit different, right? And this is especially true when you're talking crown or when you're talking floor molding that we'll do a little bit later. So when you're doing an inside corner, the best way, hands down, bar none, is to cope the joint. It's a very common DIY thing or a very common amateur carpenter thing to just do inside corner miters. A cope joint is the way to go, and I'm going to tell you why. If you miter things, remember we have a bunch of different angles, right? And we have walls that meet together, and we've discussed, I think in like every segment in this video series, nothing is ever square, right? So now you have wall 1 meeting wall 2, and you have an angle like this where the 2 pieces come together, right? So that's one angle. And now you have wall 1, that can be on one angle, and wall 2 can be on another angle. So you have a lot of things that are coming together here. If you just go ahead and you do a straight 45 miter, there's a lot that can happen there. If you do a cope joint, and what a cope joint is we cut our miter, and then we go ahead and we either take a saw or a file or a sander. In this case, we're going to use an angle grinder. I'll show you a couple different methods. And then what we do is we cut or sand down to the profile of the trim, and it meets in and it joins in with that trim profile. When you do that, it does a couple things. It really seams in really nice, and you barely need any caulk, right? If you're doing it right, and after a little bit of practice, you'll go ahead and be like, you know what, you can't even see that joint. We always caulk it anyway because things will tend to move, and it does look better when we paint it. The other thing it does when you cope a joint, if you have those off angles I was talking about, right? Your corner is off, your wall is off, your other wall is off. I'm exaggerating that obviously. But what happens is when you do that cope joint and you follow in with that profile, that curve profile of the trim, it sets in there a lot nicer and it hides those imperfections in the angle. I promise you, if I'm losing you, this is all going to come together in a few minutes. Just bear with me, okay? When we're talking cutting crown molding, that really is one of those things that there's more than one way to skin a cat, and there's a lot of different ways to do it. Everyone has their own method of doing it. The newer style miter saws are really nice because they have the auto stops for the different angles, for the different bevels on where your crown attaches to the wall and to the ceiling. They have dual bevel, they have all that stuff. There are many videos out there to show you how to figure that out. This is not going to be one of those. Reason for that is the best way I've found to do is to just hold the crown molding at an angle on the fence here and just go ahead and cut that way. So we talked about the trim protractor, right? So before I go through and before I cut my angles, it's not on camera, but after I did my measurements for each length, I went and I just checked each angle. So that really takes all of the guesswork out of it. We just hold our crown molding reverse, right? So the bottom is up and the top is down. And we just hold that against the edge of our fence and we cut on that angle. So if my angle is 44 degrees, I just set my miter to 44, 45, 46, etc., right? The key thing to know is that we're holding this in reverse, right? You're holding everything tight against the fence, you're holding it on your saw the way it will be sitting on the wall, right? That's what takes all the guesswork out of it. One of the key things to this is safety, right? Make sure that you're far enough back that you're outside of the work area of your blade. The only other thing you have to figure out is which side you want your miter, right? We have this sitting up against the fence and on the base of the saw, the way it will be sitting on the wall, right? Everything is flush and making contact. We have our angle set up. For an inside corner, when we do our miter, we actually want some of the millwork showing on the outside, right? Or some of the raw wood showing on the outside. For the outside corner, it's the opposite, right? Because we have a different angle on the wood, the way the crown is sitting up against the wall, so we actually want the raw piece of our wood on the inside, and the angle of our miter changes, right? When we're doing the inside corner, the top side is actually the shorter piece, because you have the crown sitting up against the wall and it's already angled out. When you're doing the outside corner, it's the opposite, because it's wrapping around, and now the outside corner is your long edge. So it's just a matter of trial and error, and what a lot of people will do is right off the rip, if it's their first time doing crown, they'll just cut a couple different pieces and they'll make templates out of them, right? They'll do a cut here and here, and then they'll reverse that, right? They'll do a cut on the other side of the board. So on the right side of the board, you would do a cut at 45, move your board over, give yourself some room, do another cut at 45 on the right side of the board. And then you would do the opposite end of that. You would go to the left side of the board, do a cut at 45, and then do another cut at 45, and now you have your templates, and now when you're like, hey, I have an inside corner, which piece measures up where, you can fit the boards together, and you would write down on your board. Up against the fence, right side board, left side of the board, 45 right, 45 left, and you kind of make your own little templates. Once you get used to doing crown molding, and once you learn the angles and understand that concept, that things are fitted up against the wall like this, right? And you have your short pieces and your long pieces and how that switches, and once you get an eye for that, you really won't need those, right? And at the end of the day, if you cut the piece and it's wrong, well, just reverse it, right? Just figure out your angle again. And this is where it's all going to start to make sense, right? Just bear with me. So now I have my piece, we're going to hold it tight, we're going to be very mindful of our fingers. If you look on my board here, I have the milled side of the board, or the raw wood, right? That is, a little bit of that is showing on the face, and then we're going to cut that off with our coat. And what I actually do is when I mark that, I mark it about 1/16 of an inch bigger, right? And I find that when I do that, I mark it just that 1/16 of an inch bigger. If I miss my line, right, if I go a little too close, well, I've got some leeway. If as I'm cutting, I see I'm right on point, well, now I just move my board in just that little bit of a 1/16 inch, and it comes out perfect every time. You will find your own method on doing this, right? You'll find you might normally cut boards a little bit on the shorter end. Well, now maybe you'll extend your normal mark out to 1/16 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch. Sometimes you'll cut boards on the longer end, which that's better, right? Because you can always nibble back on your board. You can't extend your board after you cut it. So if you find you're always cutting boards a little bit longer, well, maybe you make your mark a little shorter or nibble back when you see it's too long. Now I'm on the opposite side, so I just need to reverse my miter, and it's out of room, so I'm just going to move my saw over a little bit. I have my mark on the board right here. I'm just going to take the edge of my miter right through that. If you can see there, essentially what we have the raw side of the wood there, right? And if you look, it's sticking out at an angle, at about a 30-degree angle. What we need to do is we need to mill this out, and we need to cut this off and almost give like a little bit of a back cut so that it can meet the other piece of crown that's on the wall and meet that joint, right? And I talked about how we do that cope joint and how we make the profiles fit. The traditional method to do these cope joints is to use what's called a coping saw. An absolute viable option, right? I'll do it every now and again in a pinch when I don't want to take out the angle grinder, and that will make sense in a minute when I show you the angle grinder method. To do this, we just go ahead and we cut right along, following along where that paint profile meets the raw wood profile, and just going right along and making that natural curve of the crown molding. So we have this bottom piece here that's always on, that follows the angle. That always gets squared up. Now we just cut along that curve profile.
Very sorry for the camera focus or lack thereof in this segment. The camera was set to autofocus and it really couldn't decide what it wanted to focus on. But if you look close, you'll see that I am kind of cutting right along where that raw wood meets that paint profile. And when we get to the other segments with the angle grinder, it will show a little better kind of what we're trying to accomplish there.
So a little more jagged than I would have liked on that cut, but it's also my first cope in probably well over 2 years, right? And a time frame measured in years, not weeks or months. And I'm going to show you why. Once you see this angle grinder method, I think you'll see that's the way to go. But one of the other tips of the trade here is to take a piece of sandpaper that I use spray adhesive, and I have that following the contour of a piece of scrap crown. What we're going to do is now we're going to match up the profile for this crown onto the sandpaper. This is the trick to a really good coat. And that actually, all things considered, is really a pretty good looking joint right there. So now we have these on the ceiling, the profile end that we cut right here will just fall into the face profile on our short boards or our horizontal boards, and that seam will just kind of disappear. That's how you use a coping saw. I'm going to show you a different method right now with the angle grinder. Using the angle grinder method, it creates a lot of dust, right? So first and foremost, dust mask, right? Even doing raw wood, right? You still don't want to be breathing in those particles. And then keep in mind, if you look at the label on this, it doesn't say pine crown molding. It says finger joint pine crown molding, right? So it's smaller pieces that they use a finger joint router cut in and glue them together. So don't think that you're just aerosolizing raw wood particles here. There is a level of glue and stuff in these holding them together. So you do want to protect yourself, especially if you aerosolize that. You don't want to be breathing any of that crap in. So we've got the dust mask. One of those filtered face masks are even better. The other thing I have here is my air purifier. I brought this down out of my shop. It just hangs in my shop by these little chain hooks. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that on, and you might even see the sawdust. This does an excellent job at sucking that sawdust in through the filter and then filtering that stuff out of the air.
This is just kind of a bad camera angle to show you how we do the cope with the angle grinder. You'll see it a little more at the end of the cut, but I have plenty more camera angles that show in a little more detail how we actually accomplish this.
As always, remember, wear your respiratory and your eye protection. On the angle grinder, be very careful with this thing. All right, a lot of injuries can happen with this. Be very safe. Make sure you're following the manufacturer recommendations for the safety and the user guidelines. On this, it is equipped with what's called a flap disc, and it's basically just a bunch of pieces of very rough and very tough sandpaper that overlap each other, and that's what allows me to mill that material away very quickly. And if I have a piece that's too long, I just go ahead and I just nibble a little end off, and I just keep shaving a little bit off until it eventually fits, right? Take your time, make it look right. Don't rush it. Haste makes waste. As far as the grit on the flap disc, a couple different ones you can use. Some of the really skilled people will use a 40 grit, stepping up to a 60 and then an 80. I like the middle road, I like the 60. If you're just trying it out for the first time, maybe step it up to an 80. Just remember, the less rough your sandpaper is, the more time it's going to take you to mill away that material.
Let's talk respiratory protection really quick. We only get one set of lungs. We want to keep those safe, want to keep them healthy. If you can smell the particles that you're grinding down with that angle grinder and putting into the air, you need to adjust your respiratory protection because it's not filtering everything out. I find that generally when I don't have a beard, those medical grade N95 masks work very well. I just pinch that nose cup, mold it around my face, inhale sharply. You should feel the mask suck in towards your face. If you don't, you need to either adjust or get new protection. If I'm using MDF style boards, it is not an option. I'm using that full face respirator with the P100 style filters to really make sure to filter everything out. A couple things here really quick. Hopefully I'm in frame here. I have the camera viewer turned the other way. First of our longer pieces going in, right, those vertical pieces as I've been referring to them as. This one actually took me about 2 or 3 tries to get the length right on the miters. I had to do that whole nibbling process, cutting back, and then doing the coping with the flat disc to mill the material off. Every time I do crown, it takes me a few pieces, depending on how long since I did it last, to kind of recalibrate. So the point I'm getting at here is if this is your first time doing it, don't expect your first, second, maybe even 5th or 10th piece to go in right, okay? It's a skill that takes a while, and even if you're familiar with it, you have to dust the cobwebs off, you have to kind of get the refeel for things as you do that. There's not a lot of room for error here, and what I mean by that is if you are just a little bit too long or a little bit too short, it is exaggerated because of the angles, right? On a normal piece, if you're just doing a flat miter cut, if you take 1/8 of an inch off, that translates to 1/8 of an inch on your flat plane. When you're on the miters like this, what looks like 1/8 of an inch may only be like a 32nd of an inch, or maybe 3/8 of an inch. The vision is skewed on it because you're on that angle. So don't get frustrated, all right? The point I'm trying to make here is you may need to do a lot of practice pieces if it's your first, second, even 10th time doing it. On that note, remember, your tolerances aren't going to meet up quite as good, right? When we're doing like the wall trim, we try and get everything like right in there nice and tight. On the crown, don't be afraid to leave it just a little bit short, right? Because what's going to happen is if you try and snug that up really tight, and you try and really pound the pieces in, you're like, you know what, I'm just going to do a leap of faith here, I'm going to hammer fist this bad boy in, you can actually go ahead and crack the reveals where they show, right? You crack where it goes on the profile, usually on the top or the bottom, and now you've just burned that piece, right? So if it's not fitting, if it's tight, I think I can push it in, don't do it. Nibble a little section off, cope it back down, and try again. And if it's too short, use the piece somewhere else or scrap it, no big deal. The other point I'll make with that, and then I'll carry on, is if you have that where your piece isn't perfectly in, right? And again, if it's your first time doing it, it's probably not. It's probably going to be more so the last piece is going to be perfect. So what I would actually recommend in that case is if you can, if you have a piece that you know is going to be like the showpiece section where you know the eyes are going to go to right away, maybe save that section for last because you'll have to practice doing it. But going back to the point at hand here, if you have it where it's just a little bit short, right, remember the visuals of the room. If you come down the stairs, we're going to be looking the long way down the room here. So as I go to take things tight, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make it tight up against this front beam here because that's where the eyes are going to focus. That's where I want it to seem tighter. Back here, it's still pretty tight, right? You probably it's hard to see it, but I know that that's just going to be like a little bit of a bigger gap there. Well, these are all going to get caught anyway. And then the other thing I'll say before I carry on here is don't be afraid to fire a few extra nails in, right? Every extra nail is a nail hole we have to fill. That is true, and I despise a lot of things. Filling nail holes is one of them. So that's why it's kind of like an oxymoron me saying this. I'd much rather have a few extra nail holes to fill than the piece of crown be loose and then have our caulk seam show a year down the road and having to have a callback to have to fix it. basically what I'm doing here is I'm just kind of showing you a little trick of the carpentry trade, which is to trace around that profile where the paint meets the raw wood right on the edge there. And then that way when we're coping, whether it be with a saw or with the angle grinder like we are now, it will actually give us just a little more of a landmark. It'll make things easier to see. And you'll see there when I'm using the angle grinder, I mill a lot of the material away, almost right up to the edge of where the wood meets the paint. And as I get close, I just roll the angle grinder up just to kind of smooth things out with the profile. You may or may not notice here I have kind of a weird angle on the wall, and it almost looks like the piece of crown is twisted. So because we traced out our reveal lines for top and bottom before, I know exactly where I have to nail everything in. So I nail it one side, I use my putty knife there to kind of pull the board away, twist it into place, hold it where my reveal mark should be, and then we can nail everything in, get it nice and solid and square. Again, here just kind of showing you how that pencil can really show you that the exaggerated line and where you need to mill to on your coping. And again, here just kind of watch the technique of the angle grinder. I take a lot of that material away, and as I get close, I just kind of roll it right up into that profile where the wood meets the paint, or right on my pencil line, and it gives us a really smooth finish. One thing I want to discuss quick is a term called a double cope. And if you look at most of the boards we're putting in here, it has a cope on each end of the board. So you want to try to avoid that in general if you can. It's always best to try and cope one side and then flat cut the other. That way you can always just nibble away at your flat cut and make everything's really flush. It's a lot less for margin of error. But as this shot right here on the screen shows, no matter which way, whether you're entering or exiting this room or in the basement, that long axis is always going long down the room, and that's where the eyes are going to focus. So we really didn't have an option to kind of hide those seams, but to do a double cope on each end. But in general, if you can plan it when you're doing your layout and looking at things, you want to try and only cope one side of the board if possible. But as you can see from this segment right here, it's really not the end of the world if you can't. We'll make it work if we have to.
Alright gang, we're at the portion now where the coffered ceiling, or at least the carpentry portion of it, is just about done. We got our box beams in, we got our crown in, everything is nailed up, glued up. Before I get too far down the rabbit hole into the nail hole filling and the painting and the caulk portion of this, I just want to go ahead and show you just a few of the quick techniques here and do some recap on what we did. So when we did our box beams, remember how we had the cleats in the ceiling with those 2x4s, we built our beams around that. There's a couple different techniques you can do for coffered ceilings. It's like skinning a cat, right? There's plenty of different ways to do it. For this project here, that's just what I decided to do. Sometimes I'll use plywood and I'll make like little U-shaped forms and put those along and align those with a level. It just all depends on the project, right? For this one here, just with the setup that we had, I found that was just going to work best for me. It's just time and experience what finding works best for you. Again, there's no right or wrong way. Well, there's a lot of wrong ways to do it, right? But there's also a lot of right ways to do it. So find what works best, and if it's not working out, if it's not looking good, take steps back and fix what's making it not look good and make everything seem right. But if you do these techniques, or you do some of the other trusted techniques that you find in other videos, maybe we'll do some more videos in future projects down the road that should set you up for success. Remember when you're doing your crown molding, right? That's a lot of trial and error. You probably saw a lot of these. I tend to cut them a little bit long and then nibble down as I go. You'll find, especially when you're doing your coping, sometimes your angles aren't always right. And that's kind of why I like the coping method over the box method. I'm going to show you in just a few seconds here. But I'm dealing with a lot of angle challenges here because I'm in an already built house, right? Any corner, even in brand new construction, is usually not square on all different ways, right? But that's especially true when you have an already established structure because it's had time to settle, right? And especially this one is like a remodel on top of a remodel type thing. So whenever you're doing that, coping is generally the preferred method. When you're building a box frame with crown molding, that I'm going to show you in a second, you have to be pretty right on with your angles. When you're doing coping, you can actually be out of angle 2 to 3 degrees and still have your cope fit and have a good tight seam. That's one of the reasons I like it, especially for bigger areas like this, right? And especially when you have angle problems. You'll find, especially when you're doing your coping, when you're putting your pieces in and you're trying to line everything up nice and tight and hide those seams, sometimes the bottom will be nice and tight and the top will have just a little bit of a gap to it, or vice versa. Once you get a few practice cuts underneath you and realistically you screw a few up, you'll know how to adjust your saw a little bit, right? You'll know, okay, well, this isn't necessarily a 45. Let me knock this back to maybe 43, 42 and a half. That will close up that top gap a little bit and widen out that bottom one, and everything will fit in nice and tight. That's just something that comes with experience and time and trial and error on the saw. A note on adjusting the saw. Whenever you're doing these trim projects, you always want to make sure and fine tune your saw. You always want to check your owner's guide. Generally that involves using a square, putting it up to the fence, bringing your blade down, making sure everything is nice and square, and then you can actually go through and adjust your angle settings or the angle plates on your saw to make sure that they're on a true square 45 and 90. I even know a lot of carpenters who will intentionally misadjust their saw before they start a project to take it fully out of alignment. That way they know that they're starting with something fresh. They force themselves to re-square it every time. Again, check the owner's manual of your saw. Next thing I want to talk about quick is actually doing a prefabricated box frame, or actually mitering our inside corners instead of coping them. We talked before, in general, coping is going to be my preferred method, especially when we have bigger open sections like this, right? You'll see why it's kind of tough to pre-assemble a frame and glue and pin up miters. But if I'm doing things that have smaller sections, about 3.5, 4 feet is the biggest I want to go when I'm gluing up crown for inside corner miters, and you'll see why in a second. But if I have something that I know is square, if I'm kind of doing it from start to finish, and I mean with that I mean like working on the underframing, the sheetrock, I know things are really good and things are for the most part pretty close to those 90 and 45 corners. A lot of times I'll opt to do glued up miters in the frame. And in this case here, again, things are a little bit bigger. It just wouldn't make sense to do prefabbed miters. But in a lot of cases, this will be your better choice. I'm going to do a quick mock-up here to show you what that looks like. And remember, we're going to cut nested on this. This isn't going to change. When we coped, we had cut, and I don't know if I used that term before. I remember I was drawing a memory blank on it. But when you're cutting with the crown upside down, and by that I mean the bottom obviously up and against your fence, and the top is down on the table with the saw. That's what we call cutting nested. And I talked before, be very careful with this because you're trying to hold it in place on the fence. Make sure, again, you're following the manufacturer recommendations of your saw, but that you're out of the way. You shouldn't be holding close to the blade to hold this to the fence. There are actually setups out there, and I have this is kind of my portable saw setup, so I carried it down to the basement on this job site here. But on my bigger saw setup, I actually have a set of trays that go in, and it has an adjustable fence that you can move in on the bottom, so I don't have to worry about that, right? I've set everything up, I slide in my bottom adjustable fence, and I can back my hands away and I can cut. I use that on my, again, that's a setup on my bigger saw. I'll use that on especially my bigger jobs. Use the makeshift setup here. Normally what I would do is I would have this on my work site, right? And normally if I'm doing box frames, if it were the case where I was doing it down here in the basement, this is definitely something I'd like be working up in the garage or the driveway. And normally what I do is I have my sawhorses up and I have a 4x8 sheet of plywood that I use as a makeshift workbench. And you're going to see why in a minute, why I'm going to want all of that workspace. Because I'm just doing 16-inch pieces here just to give you an idea of how we would assemble this on a job site. But in real life, this would be a 3 or 4 foot box frame. I'm going to want a lot of working space for that. And when I say box frame, I mean like a miter box, right? In real life, in a real project, this would be a 3 or 4 foot, crown molding miter box I would be setting up here. So I would want all of that space to work, not only with the molding, but also with my tools. So we have our miter section set up here. We have our pin nailer. The other thing we're going to have here is this set of Collins clamps. I got about 15 in my bag here. They come with this set of pliers, and what they are is they're predisposed to stay closed. And you need the pliers to open them. We're going to set our corners, and then we'll clamp them with the tool and the clamp, and then they will hopefully stay and look good. So the first thing we're going to want to do is get a little bit of glue on our edge here. First one is always kind of the trickiest. I'll flip that around so you can see how these clamps go on. See how those just kind of dig in like that? I'll see if I can get a close-up when the video's done. There is a lot of pressure going in on this, right? It doesn't look like it, but these are really digging inside that board there. That's not something you want to pinch your finger in. Now the reason I want to start with these clamps before I pin it is we want to line the profile up where everything is matching. The shutter, a little bit of glue squeeze out there. And a lot of people will just go ahead and line these up by the back. But what you can tend to happen is if you line it up just by the back miter and say, oh, everything's lined up and it's good, you'll find your profile doesn't always match up. That's because even if you have the same bundle of wood that's wrapped together, they are oftentimes coming off, a different assembly line or something, right? So a lot of times your profiles are just off a little bit. So I always line things up on the inside profile. And the clamps give you just enough pressure to where you can still maneuver things and line them up. And that looks really good. Once we have that, I'm going to take my pin nailer, just fire a couple pins in, stop it from shifting. And the rule with the pin nailer is the same as a framing nailer or a finishing nailer. Keep your fingers away from where you're nailing in case you get an errant one that splits out the side, which happened here. We're going to leave our clamps on and just go to the next one. You can see why I use a 4x8 sheet of plywood to glue these up. So remember, your Collins clamp will give you some wiggle room on moving things around, right? So just kind of hold it in place to start, get it close, set your clamp in, and then you can maneuver from there. Probably because they're from two different bundles, but my back corner is flush, but my profile has a lot of work that needs to be done to it to make it match up. You feel this right now, it's pretty stable, right? Like I can, even with just the pins and the Collins clamps on there. So what I'll do when I have these is I'll let these rest up overnight, right? So if I know I'm doing 6 frames, or if I know I'm doing 16 frames, I will go ahead and I'll measure them all out, I'll glue them all up, I'll let the glue actually sit and rest overnight. You saw the nuances with that, right? You got to kind of fiddle with each one, and it's kind of like everything has a pro and con, right? Like by the time, with the first 2 you're trying to put together, they're flimsy, but you can manipulate very well. The last corner you put together, everything is stable because you have almost all the corners set, but it's much harder to manipulate because all the pressure from everything else is on that. There's no right or wrong answer to it, you just have to find what system works best for you. When I'm doing these, there are a couple things I found that work very well. So if I'm doing, whether it's 1 of these or 40 of these, however many of these sections I need to make, I will always do those at least a day before, right? So I'll measure everything, I'll make my boxes. When I'm measuring these, I'll actually cut them so that they are a 16th to a 32nd of an inch short from what my space is. As they go a little bit bigger, I might take a little more off of that for just some wiggle room. But I find when I do that, they really just slide right up into space with a little bit of pressure when I cut them just a little bit short. Then if I go to push it up into place and I find it's too snug, it just won't fit into that box beam, well, all I have to do now is just go ahead and sand a little bit of the material off where it meets the wall, right? Remember, this whole surface isn't meeting the wall. This is all void space. This part here is ceiling. It's just this about 9/16 space of an inch that is contacting. So I don't necessarily like to do that. I like everything to fit just once, but if it's your first time doing it, inevitably it might not fit right. As we talked before when we were doing the cope joints, it's better to make your cut a little bit too big and have to mill a little bit of material down than it is to make it too short and then be forced to make that decision, do I want to waste materials or do I want to fill that with caulk and hope it looks good? In my case, I hate doing I hate that phrase, do your best and caulk the rest, right? We'll get into that in the painting segment. I would rather just go ahead and have everything fit nice and snug and have it be a good tight fit. So if it is too tight and it's just not fitting up there, don't force it because you don't want to crack anything. But just go ahead and take a sander and just sand down, just keep sanding and just peeling a little bit of material away until it actually fits up in the groove where it's got to go. One of the points I had mentioned earlier is when I glue these up and I make them ahead of time, I want them to sit overnight. You'll see I use the standard Type Bond wood glue, right? A lot of people will say, well, why don't you just use the CA glue type thing? And for those that aren't familiar with CA glue, it's basically super glue. You put it on and then it has a spray activator. I use it all the time when I'm doing the outside corners. And I don't think we're going to have any outside corners later here, but if we do, I'll show you how it works. But the problem with using the CA glue is that stuff sets in about 10 to 15 seconds, and then you can't move it. Very oftentimes it will happen where I'll set my corners, and then I'll go to the 4th one, because I'm working that in, well, it works when the other one's loose, right? So then I have to go and I have to keep making these little micro adjustments. Usually it doesn't happen with the pins, but sometimes it will, right? They're just micro pins. Torque will take those off a kilter. So sometimes you have to go and make these little micro adjustments as you go here. If you use CA glue and something slips and you don't realize it, well, now you're stuck, right? In theory, it shouldn't be slipping because you have that, it sets within 10 to 15 seconds. But if you miss it where your profile is off, well, now you're stuck with that. With the standard wood glue, you have about 5 to 8 minutes of working time here before it actually starts to set. So if I notice this is off, okay, I can make my little adjustments and go. Plus, I do find that just a standard wood glue works much better when you're doing wood-to-wood surfaces than that CA glue, right? The CA glue works very well. The wood glue, just giving it time to set, is going to work better. At the end of the day in your crown project, you'll find what works best for you, right? You're not going to be able to pick one method right off the rip and say, this is going to, maybe you will, right? Maybe you're very talented, maybe the woodworking and all that carpentry comes natural to you, and you're like, you know what, this works fine, I got this using this method. But I would recommend you try both, right? Order a little extra material, inevitably you're going to waste some, see what works best for you. And again, if it's your first time doing it, expect some trial and error, expect a lot of practice pieces. Don't get frustrated at it. It takes a while to get used to it and get comfortable with it. Yeah, now that we got the crown molding, coffered ceiling, all those little tidbits out of the way, we can move on to talking about filling the nail holes and doing the caulking. So I'm just going to repeat this because I can't remember what I said in an earlier segment. It was going really good, it was flowing out, I was making sense, and then I got a phone call and that messed everything up. So there becomes a point in time where you have to transition from, is it the carpenter's job to is it the painter's job. And on most job sites where that is the carpenter will get everything set in place, right? Your beams, your crown, and they will then step away. At that point, it's up to the painter to come in and fill the nail holes, and do the caulking and do the paint and move on with the rest of the project, right? It's important at that transition process for your painters and your carpenters to have a symbiotic relationship. And it's important that, especially if you're the general contractor running this or the homeowner who's trying to parse everything out or do it yourself and transition over to somebody else, that everyone has a very clear understanding on what their roles and responsibilities are, right? Because I've seen it on jobs where the carpenter sets everything in, and then the painter comes in and take over. Carpenter thinks they're going to do the nail holes, and they either don't do them, or they're pissed that they have to do it and they do a shitty job, right? And they're like, you know what, this dude just went ape shit with the nailer and put all these unnecessary nail holes in. They get pissed off at doing that and they just do a haphazard job. So if you're the one who's running the project or doing it yourself, you have to make sure that everyone's on the same page on whose roles and responsibilities are what. Not to keep dwelling on this, but like if I'm the carpenter, right, I want my finished product to look like glass. I'm relying on the painter to do that. Okay, so if I talk to the painter and I say, hey, this is the process I want you to use for the nail holes, and this is the caulk I want you to use, and we'll get into those processes in a bit, and they say, no, I'm not doing that, well, now I got to beef with the general contractor because they're going to make my product look bad, right? And the same thing with the painter. If you have a bad carpenter, the painter's going to be like, it's my job to make this look good. I can't because they did a bad carpentry job. So I know I'm dwelling on this point a lot, but as with most things and most conflict, communication is just key, right? Make sure everybody's on the same page. Make sure everyone knows whose job is what. I've had it on jobs where the painter is like, you know what? I don't want to do that process to fill the nail holes. I'll give you a once over with putty and that's all I'm doing. If your nail holes show divots after that, it's on you. And I've had jobs where the painter is like, that's my job to fill. I will make it look good. I'll do as many parts of filler and caulk as I need to make that look smooth as glass. Again, just make sure everybody's on the same page. For this one here, I am going to fill the nail holes and do the caulking myself. Normally what I would do is I would parse that out to the painter, but in this case here, I'm just going to be doing all the painting myself anyway. There's a couple painters who I normally use who I trust to make everything look really good, and they're all just, it wasn't worth them for the money to book for this small of a job, right? It would take more time and money than for me just to do it all myself and paint everything on my own. I'd rather have them on the bigger jobs where I want them and where I want them finishing things up, where I can't devote my time to. So let's go into the nail hole filling first. All right, this is going to be a three-phase process. We're going to fill the nail holes. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to fill those cross sections and my scarf joint, and then I'm going to use caulk to fill in all the seams. And we'll go over each step in depth. To fill the nail holes, I'm going to use this white wood filler. To fill those cross sections and those butt joints, I'm actually going to use Bondo. So if you remember that Bondo is a two-component system, right? You have the filler, and then you have the hardener, and you mix it all together. So Bondo does tend to create a much stronger joint, or a much stronger filling compound, so to speak, than just plain wood filler. So that's why I want that in those cross sections on the ceiling, just because it's a little bit stronger. We'll build that up, and then we'll sand everything down nice and smooth. The caulk I'll get to when we do that. There's a couple different types of caulk, and there's really only one or two that I like using for coffered ceilings and crown moldings. I'll get into that when we get there. But for the wood hole filling, for this part here, it's going to be a two-part process, like I said, mainly because I use the 15 gauge nails. If I'm doing smaller coffering sections or smaller molding, I'll only use 18 gauge nails. For a couple of reasons. One, it's easier to take off if I misfire something, but also the nail holes are significantly smaller, so usually I can get those in just one pass of wood filler. But for the 15 gauge nails, generally I need two passes for them, especially with the battery nailer. I really like those battery nailers a lot, but I find that sometimes they're just, I mean, we're talking, you know, half a millimeter, right? We're talking just a little bit, but sometimes they vary in their depth settings. I try to adjust them so that I can get them just below the surface so that I don't have a huge hole to fill, but sometimes they do tend to set those a little bit deep, and a lot of times that matters how much pressure you have on the gun too. I find they're just a little more temperamental with their depth settings than the pneumatic nailers. But anyway, the 15 gauge nailer tends to leave a deeper and a more robust hole. So a lot of times what will happen is when I fill that, especially if I have a nail that was set a little bit too deep, you'll get a divot in there. So what I'll do is I'll go around with round one and I'll fill in all the nail holes, and I'll just put them just flush, just even with the board, right? And then usually what will happen is those will dry just to give me just a little bit of a dimple or a divot, and then I'll come back and I'll do a round two, and I'll fill it again, and I'll fill it just a little proud. I'll just mound it over just a little bit, and then I'll just come back through and I'll sand everything down flush and smooth with the profile of the crown, and then we'll be ready to go to primer paint. Well, our next step, right? We'll be ready to caulk or primer paint, whatever step is next. So I do the wood filler and the Bondo first because I usually want to give those time to dry because I'm either going to do a second coat or end up sanding. And then in the time when those are drying, that's usually when I'll do the caulk. Caulk is usually just a one and done. I'll go around, I'll check for anything I might have missed, and then we'll move on to actually doing the paint. If you're like me, I don't know what it is, doing the nail hole filling I just find tedious and monotonous. Maybe it's just, I'd rather be doing something else, right? I'd rather be working on a power tool, I'd rather be building something. But this process of the wood finishing is what makes or breaks the project, right? If you have crappy nail holes, you're always going to see that. If you have a crappy caulk job, you're always going to see that. This is where it makes sense to really just take your time and be meticulous. And like I said in the earlier segment, either the carpenter's got to do it right or the painter's got to do it right, right? One of y'all has to do it, so just make sure it's done right somewhere along the lines. This is where I just find a happy place. I put a song on, and usually I'll kind of do this in stages, right? I'll fill a few nail holes, usually like one section or two, and after this, I'm probably going to be painting, right? I'm going to be doing a few odds and ends. So for the most part, I'm done with all the scraps on the floor, and I'm done with this pile of tools behind me. So what I'll kind of do to break up the monotony is when I go to like wipe off my hands, when I just get enough wood filler built up on there, I have to wipe it off. I'll step down, wipe my hands off. I'll take a few tools up, get them ready. You know, everything's kind of covered in sawdust right now. I'll put them in a pile, get ready to spray off with compressed air. I'll come back and fill a few nail holes. Wait till I got to wipe my hands off, go do something else. For me, I just find it breaks up the monotony of the project, and it keeps my head in the game when I'm filling nail holes, and I don't like start to shortcut it or just start to hate my life. I probably dwell too much on that. It's really not that big of a deal. A couple things we'll need for this process. We already covered the white wood filler. I have my spring-loaded nail set. This is just what I like to use. That way I don't have to carry a hammer around with me. This can just stay right in my pocket, or it stays just in one of the little grooves on my platform. It just moves with me as I go. I have a damp paper towel and a dry paper towel. And as I go through this process here, you might find something else that works better for you. This is just what I have found best works for me, right? So first thing I'm going to do is I have my platform set up. I'm really going to try not to move my feet on this platform, right? Just where I can reach now, that's kind of the swath of where I work. And I just do this in each little step. So the first thing I do is I take my nail set, and this is just my spring-loaded one, right? Again, that way I don't have to carry the hammer with me. You can carry a hammer and a standard traditional nail set too. And any nails I have that are a little bit proud, just gonna knock those in. Now what I'm gonna do, I have my white wood filler. Just gonna squeeze a little bit onto my finger here. So what I'll do is I'll fill. Yeah, I'm just trying to push that in, and then I'll use my next clean finger to wipe clean. What you'll find is as your fingers start to get dirty and caked with the wood filler, they start to do less and less of a good job. So that's why I just switch to the next one on down the line, right? I find I'm just doing more smearing wood filler than I am actually pushing into the joint. Then I move on down. Now when everything is covered in wood filler and you're just smearing everything around and making a mess, take your damp paper towel, wipe everything off, and dry clean with your dry paper towel, and repeat. And I find usually at that point where everything is filled in, and now I have to wipe my hands off, it's time to pick up my platform and move it. So I just follow that process around. Again, find a happy place, find a good song. Usually I'm picking up tools in the meantime, bringing stuff out to the dumpster, just to kind of break up the monotony of just never-ending nail hole filling. It's really not that big of a deal, right? If I set the timer, it would probably be like a fraction of how long I think it takes. It's just one of those things I just don't like doing. And it's one of those things that if you have a good apprentice or someone who wants to learn, have them do this part, right? Just make sure they're doing a good job, because if it's something they're, somebody's not enjoying doing, they tend to start skimping as they go on down the line. We have our first round of nail hole filling done. I took some close-up shots. I'll work on embedding those into the video so you can kind of see what it looks like. And to give you an example of what you're looking at is, hopefully they're like embedded right there, I'm gonna guess, is they actually have like a dimple in them. And that always happens the first round of nail hole filling, right? And I showed you a couple different shots there. Some of them I purposely left on some excessive nail hole filling compound. So you can see no matter how much you mound that over, it still gets that little dimple on the inside. That's why I always do it in a two-part process. The first part, I fill it and I wipe it pretty clean, because no matter what, you get that little dimple in there. But what I find is when you do that, it gives it a good backing to set on, right? So now when we do our second mound, I'll mound that over a little bit, almost kind of like a little eye drop over it, kind of. And then that'll let everything settle in, and then I can sand everything nice and flush. Sometimes the really big gaping holes, if I had to really set a nail in there or something or got overzealous, I might have to do a third round in there, but those are usually few and far between. But you kind of get the point there. The first round, just give it a wipe clean, just give it some backing to set on. No matter what, it's going to settle in there on the nail head, and you want that, right? You don't want to go too heavy. You want that first layer to actually settle in onto the nail. That way it gives you a good base. So 3-4 years down the road, once things start shifting and cracking, and with the bass and the speakers here, you don't want those parts of the nail hole filling kind of falling out or losing where they are, right? We want a good solid nail hole fill that's going to last a long, long time, make this look smooth as glass forever. So now we'll just go ahead and do our second round and move on. So remember, for the second coating here, I'm not so much really pressing that in there like I did the first time, right? The first time was to really press that in there, get the compound making good contact deep in and with the nail head. And now I'm just doing like a little kind of mound over there to make sure that we're filled nice and good. Don't worry about sanding these over. We're going to sand them over, but it's going to go really quick, right? You get a lot of people that don't do that, right? Always wipe it clean. If you go and you put that much material on there, you're going to have to sand that down. You always need some sort of polishing with this stuff, right? And that's a term that I had learned from a sheetrocker a while back. People try and get things nice and smooth. If you're doing it right, you're always going to have some sort of polishing and finishing work. You have to get it looking good, nice and smooth. It sands down really quick. Everyone has their own little method. None of them are really right or wrong. I see a lot of people use that dry dex, the purple top spackling. I personally don't like using that. I find it dries and it shrinks a lot more than the wood filler does. And I also find that over time it doesn't hold up as well, and you start to see those, it starts to flash through. Even when you do primer in that paint, you still kind of see that flash through. When I say flash through, you can see it's a different substrate behind the paint, right? You'll see those little nail hole specks. I find with the wood filler, I don't get that. If I do a good primer and I use a good paint, I never see that. Some people use window glazing. That also works well. Again, this is just the method that I found works best for me. And I want to be up here sanding. I want to be able to look at each nail hole and be like, I'm not going to see this one. I'm not going to see this one. I'm not going to see this one. If I can't do that, I'm not happy. And if I'm not doing that, again, I want to make sure that my painter, that's something that they're going to do. Talk while I work here, because if you remember from earlier when we had talked about using Bondo, it's a pretty quick set time, about 3 to 5 minutes. What I'm doing here is I'm just using Bondo to fill my gaps where we have these intersections here, as well as the nail holes. Could use wood filler for the nail holes, but just gonna use the Bondo. And the reason I'm using Bondo here, and I'm just kind of working that into the gap there. Smooth it in. we'll just mound that over just a little bit. The reason I'm using Bondo is because Bondo has a much better bond, so to speak. That's called Bondo. So because we have those two pieces of wood that are together there, I just want the Bondo in there because it's going to form a little bit of a stronger joint. And then of course we'll come in with the sander, we'll hit all this and sand it all down. Bondo does also tend to shrink a lot less too for the nail hole filling. You just generally don't use it for filling nail holes because it has a quicker working time. But in this case here, since we have it out, we'll use it. See, I'm only a couple minutes into this and I can already start to feel it set up. So we'll go down, we'll hit those other spots we got to fill, and we'll come back a little later and sand. What I'm doing here is I mixed up a fresh batch of Bondo because that other one was already starting to set up. Bondo sets up quick, and the more hardener you put in it, the more it sets up even faster. So I'm just going over these screw holes here. I'm not going crazy, just enough to cover and fill them. And then I'll sand down nice and smooth here. Again, I'm not trying to make this like stain grade perfect. I'm just trying to cover the bigger gaps, both with the inside of the head of the screw. And forgive me for talking to my work and not the camera. The stuff sets up right before your eyes, so I'm trying to get it in there. So what I'm trying to do is just fill these in so that when we do our epoxy overcoat and we start laying the carbon fiber into this, we don't have any divots. I don't think that's going to happen, especially with the epoxy. It should just fill right in. But when I go to lay that carbon fiber on, that's kind of go time, right? We're going to do, and you'll see when we do it, we do a layer of quick coat epoxy, and then we just start smoothing everything on. When that happens, I don't want there to be a divot in that carbon fiber. Again, you probably wouldn't see it because it's going to get all filled in with casting epoxy. But the more I can prepare my substrate ahead of time, and the more margin for error I can take out of everything, the better. We may very well need to do a second set of, a second batch of Bondo here. While I'm here, I'm just going to fill this part in too. That's already set up. We're about done with this batch. You see how quick that sets up on you? I mean, that was a matter of minutes. So I just say when we only mix a batch that you can use in a few minutes. So if it's your first time ever using Bondo, be prepared for that, right? Be prepared to have to do a couple batches to get it right. We're at the point now we have all of our nail holes filled. We're going to let that wood filler dry and cure overnight before we sand it, just so I can make sure that we have all the settling and shrinking that's going to do before I hopefully sand just about all of those down to their final coat. So our next step is going to be to caulk our gaps. We have two areas where we're going to caulk the gaps. It's going to be in our crown molding and on those box beams that we had done. A few nuances to talk about with the caulking, both with the tools, our methods, as well as the different types. And caulking is the same as my process for the nail hole filling, doing sheetrock, and anything we've talked about in any of these segments or I talk about in any of my videos. There's usually more than one way to do things. The process I do is what found works best for me, and I have found it works best both in cleanliness and timeliness throughout the years. A different contractor may do things a little bit different. You may find a different method works for you, but this is what works for me and what I've found works best over the years. So when we're talking about our caulking, not all caulk tubes are created equal, right? This is one of those cases where price does matter. With most things, price matters, especially with the quality of your caulking. So a couple different nuances here with our caulk. I will never, from this point forward, with all the products that are available, use a non-siliconized caulk. And basically what siliconized means is it's fortified with a little bit of silicone in there. It gives it better adhesion properties, so it sticks to the materials a little bit better. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes when I'm talking about the actual application process. The other thing I want to talk about is the applications for the caulk. All right, this one here, the 950 from Sherwin-Williams, like it a lot. I generally will use this for floor trim. Okay, it's a good product. It's got a 55-year rating on it, but it doesn't necessarily have the best adhesion and the best flexibility. It actually has pretty good adhesion, but for flexibility, it has good, but not the best. So if it's something where we're talking about floor trim, this is a little bit of a lighter bodied formula, so it's easier to work with and easier to just go ahead and wipe and move on with my life. So floor trim, this is what I do all day long, as well as door trim. But when we're talking about our ceiling sections, we're going to want a little bit of different product, and we're going to move into these. We have the Sherwin-Williams, I mix these up all the time, the Sheer Max and the Max Flex. Right? Max Flex has a 60-year rating, Sheer Max has a lifetime rating. Whenever I'm doing something outside, I'll always use the Sheer Max, because that's just a better product for the outside, and then just a step down from that is the Max Flex. I use them interchangeably inside, pretty much whatever's on the shelf. The key to these ones is they're what's called an elastomeric caulk, all right? There's a little bit of difference in the compound. This one is urethane-based. This one is acrylic-based. I'm not going to get into the nuances on that. Generally, the urethane, you're always going to want to use that outside. So they're both ready for exterior, but I'll always use this outside. Inside, I'll use either or. If I have some of the Sheer Max laying around, I'll use that. Otherwise, the Max Flex works just the same. Like I said, that's got the 60-year rating on it versus the lifetime. But if I'm still doing this shit in 60 years, like something has gone horribly wrong. I've made very, very bad financial decisions. I'm probably not still going to be alive in 60 years, let's be honest. But if I am, kudos to the medical field. They've made great advancements. And if I'm still doing this shit in 60 years, I'm probably the half robot at that point. There's really good advancements to the medical field. I think you guys see my point. They both have excellent ratings, and just make sure you're using a good product to go from there. And just going back to that elastomeric, that's exactly what it sounds like, right? It has really good elasticity properties. So they're siliconized, so they have really good adhesion. So as soon as we put that on a material and start wiping it, it's going to have good adhesion and good stickiness into the boards. And it has that elastomeric property, so it has some of the best flexibility, right? Like the Sheer Max is touted as having, in the Sherwin-Williams product line, it has the best flexibility to it, followed closely by the Max Flex. When we're talking about the different products that are available, specifically talking about Coffered ceilings and crown molding, these are generally the only two that I will use, even specific down to the type, as well as the brand Sherwin-Williams. If I'm in a bind, if I'm doing a project and I don't have these, I will use one of the better products from a box store. But like I said, it has to be that elastomeric. If it's not elastomeric, I won't use it on a ceiling-based application. When I say ceiling-based, I'm talking Coffered ceilings and crown molding. I think I've made my point on what type of caulk to use as well as what type of caulk not to use, right? Let's talk a little bit about the application process and how I get set up here. Again, this is just what works best for me. Someone else might have a different process. But one of the biggest things I see when people are doing caulking jobs is they open their tube way too wide, right? They open it up to this huge gaping opening, and now they're trying to control that and feather it onto the board, and you just have this huge 1/4-inch bead going across, and now you're trying to wipe that off. And you end up getting what's called snowplow, or what I call snowplow, on your fingers, right? You're wiping that off, you have a huge excess, you have to wipe that off. It's smearing all of your material, and it's just a mess, and you hate caulking, and you hate life, and you wonder why you do this DIY job. I'm going to teach you how to avoid that. And it all starts with when we open our tube. So I generally will start doing it at a 45-degree angle, and I'll just start nibbling off the top. Just enough to where I get a very small opening in the tube. And then I'll just take that end, and I'll even it up. That's not going to make a difference. I'm going to show you why in a second. I'm going to get a picture of that so you can kind of see how exactly small I'm talking here. That's a very small opening in the top there. We can always squeeze more caulk out. I can slow down my speed of the caulk gun and squeeze a little bit more, but we can't reverse that, right? If I make my tip here too wide and I open that too far, well, now I always have a certain minimum amount of material coming out. The next step is I'm just going to take some sandpaper here, fold that over, I'm just going to sand back the edges of my caulk tube at about a 45 on each side. And this is what really separates this into the next category, right? So now what will happen, now that I have these edges sanded down, just a little bit, right? You don't have to go crazy, but now when I'm putting this into my gaps, right, remember, just about all the angles we have, whether it's crown to ceiling, crown to box beam, or box beam to box beam, all those gaps should be right around 90 degrees, right? Maybe give or take like a fraction of a degree. So now that I have that sanded at about a 45-degree angle on each side, that's going to let the tip sit right in that crevice and guide right along and just guide our caulk right into those gaps that we want to move into, right? If we didn't do that, well, it's going to kind of set back a little bit, and now I'm going to have to push that even more up into the crevice that we want to seal, and it's just going to have more caulk on our substrate, and it's going to be more that we have to clean off. The goal of caulking is to just hide those little gaps, right? So the less that we can have on our material, the less we have to wipe off, the smoother paint finish we're going to have. You may or may not have seen it where people just go ape shit and go crazy with the caulk, and you can actually see the buildup, right? You can almost see it like smeared across there. It just looks bad. The least we can do, and the more we can actually get that up into that crevice, the better. Which brings me to my next point, is our caulking gun. This is I don't want to call it a good caulking gun, it's just a standard dripless caulking gun. So the way the dripless ones work is when you push on them, it's going to slide back just a little bit when you let go of the handle. All right, that's the design of the caulking gun. So when I'm squeezing the handle, it goes in with a lot of force. When I'm not squeezing the handle, it kicks back just a little bit. And if you see, if I let go of the handle all the way, if there's enough back pressure, it will slide and release all the way back. There's the caulk guns that have the tab on it to maintain the pressure. The problem with those, and they're good, right? I got a bunch of them. That's the spare one I keep in the truck. But the problem with those is once you stop caulking, because it has the tab on there, it's holding force on the caulk tube, and it's going to keep squeezing the caulk out at the end. So you might have an inadvertent release, and also it's just going to keep oozing out of the end when you set it down on your platform or wherever you're setting your caulk gun to keep working. So when you're doing painting type caulk, I always recommend the dripless gun. You guys have seen me use my battery operated caulk gun a lot when we're talking to construction adhesives. I generally don't like that when we're talking a paint related job. And the reason for that is I really like the feedback that this handle provides, right? I really like to be able to feel as I'm squeezing the handle, as I can feel the product coming out, and I can see it going where I need it to go. You lose a little bit of that dexterity or that tactile feel when you're using the electronic caulk gun. Talked about our caulk, talked about the opening, talked about the type of caulk gun. Now let's talk about the actual application process. When we're getting that and we're squeezing that into the crevice, right? And again, you should just be laying that right on the edge, and if you did everything right and you have good control of your caulk gun, you should actually see that bead almost kind of laying itself right up into that gap. And then the next step we're going to have to do is we're going to have to smooth that out with our finger, right? And that does two things. One, it smooths out the bead, it kind of makes it disappear, and it hopefully pushes that bead right up into that crevice. And you're going to have a little bit of buildup on the edges, you know, on your substrate. Remember, say it's a 90-degree angle there, or about. So you're going to have a little bit of buildup on your pieces of wood, but most of that caulk should be getting forced up into the crevice. And that's going to do a couple things. It's going to stop that kind of nasty oozing stuff that you have, and just it looks like nasty, messy caulk, and you have to wipe it all away. And it's also going to form a thicker bond of material in between those cracks and really get what you paid for with the good elastomeric caulks and make it so you have like a good kind of rubber flexible seal. Now to do that and to keep things clean, this is the method that I have found works the best. In this spray bottle here, I have some soapy water. What I do is when I put my bead on, I then just take, you'll find your own way, but I take my index and my pointer fingers, and I just spray a little bit on there, right? Just enough to make them damp. We don't want to go too hard here because I don't want to mix too much water in with the caulk. And remember, I started to talk more about the siliconized caulks in a bit. Aside from having the properties where they stick to the substrate, when you have the siliconized caulk, it's also a little more impervious to the water. But with that being said, it sticks to things a little bit more, including your skin and your hands. So I just get a little bit of mist onto my fingers, just enough to wet things, so when I'm spreading across, right, it doesn't stick to my hands, and it actually forces it up into that crevice. If we're using a non-siliconized caulk, right? Remember, silicone is kind of impervious to water. You can actually use these products. They're rated for sinks and bathtubs. The point I'm trying to make there is the water won't necessarily mix with this caulk, right? So once you're doing that, but it should hopefully glide over your finger and then force its way into where it needs to be. The other reason we're doing that and wetting our fingers is to keep them clean. Now when we go to wipe our hands off, it should hopefully wipe right off. If you have never caulked before, it can be a very, very messy job, all right? And I'm not necessarily talking like a bathtub or a sink where you just do a couple feet of it, right? We are doing a lot of linear feet of caulking here. It will get everywhere if we don't take precautions. So what I do, and again, my own method, right? You might not agree with this, but what I do is each time I run my fingers on a bead of caulk, it really shouldn't be sticking because I have my fingers sprayed down, right? Is I wipe off. And as I'm going, if I have like too heavy of a bead on there and I see it starting to build up, right? And remember we talked about that snow plow. If I can see it where it's visibly building up on my finger instead of forcing its way into the crevice, I'll just take a paper towel and I'll wipe my finger off, respray, and just keep going. Once I have done that entire swipe, I get rid of this paper towel, right? I clean my fingers off, hopefully everything is clean, it's gone, and I move on to the next one. Every time I start doing a new section, I just tear off a bunch of pieces and I carry them either on my ladder or my platform or whatever I'm working on. And the reason I do that is as I wipe off, so to speak, I have contaminated this paper towel with caulk. And I don't mean contaminated with toxicity, but now it's not clean, right? So now I'm going to keep doing that. I'm going to have little white marks of caulk. Doesn't matter if I fold it up, eventually that's going to start getting other places. I'm going to wipe my finger on an already dirty paper towel and get wiped off caulk on my finger. I'm going to start getting it in my non-wiping hand. And it just gets everywhere. Remember, we talked about the siliconized caulk. It sticks very well, including to your skin, and it just creates a mess, and you're going to spend more time trying to wipe things off. And now when you have a buildup of caulk on your finger, and you're trying to go through and caulk a new section, well, now it's going to be more prone to stick to your hands even more instead of moving into the substrate where it needs to go. So that's just the method I found works the best. And even for, like, not even for carpentry caulking, even when you're talking like a sink or a tile backsplash or something, when you're talking that stuff with full-on silicone, I'll actually spray the entire area and then my hands, and it just gives you a very nice bead. But I think I've made my point there, right? The concept is pretty simple. If you start doing this and you employ this method, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. If you don't start using a fresh paper towel every time, you're going to see where it starts to build up, right? And does it use a lot of paper towels? It does, but it also keeps things clean. You're probably going to use less overall if you're going to have to clean up less. Really don't overthink the process. I know I went into a lot of detail here, but there's a lot up here. I want to make sure that you have what I have. So we talked about the prep of the tip. Go ahead and caulk your corner, spray, wipe, repeat until you're done. When we're talking our caulking here, there's two main areas we're going to want to caulk. First one is the bottom part of our box beams that we had built, where the fascia meets the bottom board. And the other one is our crown molding here, where the bottom crown meets the fascia, and where the top crown meets the ceiling. Again, I have my own process. You'll find a way that works for you, but I find this helps me skip the absolute least amount and the least moving of the platform. Generally, what I will do for my process is I will caulk the bottom part of the beams first. I'll leave the crown alone. So I'll get all of the sections, and then I'll go back, and then I'll do each box section of the crown. I just find that helps me track it a lot more. Instead of trying to caulk here, get these, I find I start missing them, right? I start working one way and then forget which way I'm going. So I just hit the beams, then I follow that up with the crown, good to go. And this is the note on these caulk tubes. Most of your painter's caulk tubes will not have a foil seal where the tip kind of goes into the rest of the tube. Once you cut off that tip, that's what then exposes everything. On most of your construction adhesives or your actual legitimate full-on 100% silicone sealants, they actually have a foil or some other type of barrier in there. So mine broke off, but most caulk guns have a pin that you can just go ahead and jab down in there. All there is to it. It takes some practice, so if it's the first time you're doing it, don't get all frustrated, right? And you'll find if you do a heavy bead and you start wiping it off and you just keep going, a lot of times that will start to mix with dirt that's on the board or even dirt in the hands if you're not spraying your hands, and it will almost kind of like bead up like a pencil eraser and you'll start rubbing it. If that happens, don't panic, don't freak out. Just go ahead and spray everything down with some water, wipe it off, start over. Now that our caulking is done, we're going to go ahead and sand down all those nail holes that we filled in with the wood filler. Like most things in this segment, there are a lot of different ways to do it. The process I'm going to show you is what I have found works best for me over the years, and a couple of just tidbits and tricks along the way to help make the process a little easier. This can be a very long and arduous process, right? Like I've actually had some off-camera work, and I have 4 of these 6 segments already sanded. It's just one of those things you got to find your happy place, find your system, and go to it. One of the things that's often up for debate during this whole process of filling the nail holes and then sanding is the best practice to do it, right? And how much is too much, how little is too little. Again, this process is what I have found works the best for me over the years, and not only what works the best for me, but more importantly, what gives me the best finished product, right? There's different shortcuts you can take, like for example, we maybe don't have to use nail hole filler. Sometimes you can use spackle, it's a little easier to sand. I find over the years that doesn't change with the wood, right, as the wood does, you know, that expansion and contraction. Well, the spackle will actually expand and contract at a different rate, so you'll tend to see those nail hole differences, right? I go ahead and I sand mine down doing a couple different tricks of sandpaper, so this way when we paint over it, everything is nice and smooth, right? And we'll get into that during the paint process. Some people will just take a sponge or a paper towel and they'll just do kind of a wet sand and wipe things away. Hey, that's all well and good, that works too, right? But I have found that when I do that, a lot of times it leaves a little bit of a dimple. You don't necessarily see that until you do the final finish paint, and then if you know you're looking for the nail holes, you'll see the little dimples along as you go. Again, everyone has their own process. This is what I have found gives me the best finished product, and when it's done, we'll use a good quality primer, we'll use a good quality trim paint, and everything will look like one sheet of glass when this is all done. To do that, you have to do the prep work, right? There's just no shortcuts around it. So again, when you're sanding and you're doing this, find your happy place. Once you get the hang of it, it'll go pretty quick. Some of the tools I'm going to be using here, I have my battery operated sander with the sponge pad, and it's basically just it's a foam sponge, and it's got Velcro for the sandpaper. We'll get into why I have that in a minute. We have the dust mat, of course, 100 grit sandpaper, and 150 grit sandpaper. The first thing I'm going to start with is this curved section on top of the crown. And that's why I have that foam sanding pad on there. So when I take my power sander and I go into here, the foam pad will actually contour to this, and it will sand it down just about almost smooth without ruining the other profiles in the corners of this. You could do that by hand, and oftentimes I do. It's just with the volume of sanding that we have going on here, anytime I can introduce a power tool into it to make the process faster, I'm of course going to do. Just be very careful as you're sanding here to not go into these corners or adjust the curve profiles. And you'll see certain parts where we sand, we do take some of the primer away, and I'll get into the repriming and why we do it on already primed wood when I actually do the painting. That's fine if you rub some of this down to bare wood, because we're going to reprime over it anyway. You just want to make sure that you don't kind of get into the corners here and start taking paint away off in the corner, because that's real easy to change the corner and the curve profile of that. So once I sand this filler down mostly smooth, usually what I'll do is I'll do one segment at a time. I'll go all the way across the top, hit the top ones, and then I'll go into this bottom flat section. And that's where the 100 grit sandpaper comes into play. When I do that, I'll start with the bigger sheet, I'll fold it in half, and I'll use the folded part to get in here to just make sure I'm nice and flat on that flat segment, right? And by folding it, it really lets me just get in there and push it in and stay on this flat part and not go onto the corner and disrupt that profile. Once I have my nail holes sanded down, I'll just do a once over on the top curve and then on the bottom curve, just to make everything as smooth as possible. And that just gives me a nice even base to get a nice coat of primer down, followed by our cones of paint. And again, that's going to be first the 100 grit sandpaper, both on these top and bottom holes, followed by the 150. And when we're talking the grit on the sandpaper, 150 is my final grit. When we're talking for a painted surface, stain I'm always going to go up to 220, but for a painted surface I find 150 is just that perfect medium, right? It sands everything down nice and smooth. It doesn't leave really any sand marks or any sand lines, but it has just enough of a rough textured surface on there to let that primer actually adhere to it and then lay flat once it's on there if you're using a good quality primer. One thing I did forget to mention is I also have my air purifier going on the ground. I just went down and turned that on. This is going to leave a whole lot of dust, so I want that air scrubber going, cleaning the air, and then again, dust mask is a must. And that's pretty much it. Like I said, right? Find a happy place and carry on and just get the sanding done. A couple quick tidbits before I shut the camera off and finish up on the sanding. Sandpaper. Make sure you're buying a good quality sandpaper. I've talked to a lot of people over the years that, I sand and the paper just shreds. Make sure you're using a good sandpaper. If it's the cheapest stuff on the shelf, maybe go up to the next step. The other thing is they do sell some different sanding products out there, right? They have sanding blocks you can put the sandpaper into. They have sanding sponges. They have sanding foam pads. I've tried them all. I've used them all. Sometimes I'll use them for different applications. Like I love the sanding sponges for drywall finishing. When it comes to actually sanding wood, sanding down nail holes, I have just found what works best for me is just folded up sandpaper, right? You take the sheet, I'll start with it folded in half. When it starts to kind of get worn and frayed, I'll fold it in half again, and I'll go into a different section of it. And I find that especially when I start folding it in on itself, the sandpaper grips itself, and it lets me hold it, like the paper doesn't wiggle around in my hands, right? It stays in place nice and good. And I just get a much more tactile feel for what I'm sanding down, and I just learn my pressure. Again, it's my method of, it's what works best for me. Another product may work best for you. The other thing, again, is I just want to reiterate, the finish on this stuff is everything. We went through a lot of work to source our material, to cut it, to cope it, to nail it, getting it up there. We don't want to botch the job by rushing the nail hole finishing, right? That's a pretty significant portion. We want this to have that nice, fine, smooth finish. That's why I'm so meticulous on making sure I'm using a good wood filler to fill the nail holes, and that I'm sanding down smooth. There are avenues you can go to make it easier. You could use spackle to fill your nail holes. I just, again, generally don't like doing that because I find, one, it shrinks and I have to fill them a lot to get it smooth. It does sand down easier, but over the years, as the wood expands and contracts, you'll see those holes either start to pop out a little bit or recess in a little bit. Same thing with the sanding using a sponge or a paper towel for wet sanding. That is a trend that a lot of people do, but again, you tend to wash away the filler in there, and then a few years later, sometimes even a few weeks or months later, if you're doing the wet sand method, you'll start to see those little dimples. It's just not something that I want to put my name on. That's just not the way I like to do it, right? It's one of those pet peeves. Well, I have many pet peeves, but when I look at a piece of trim, whether it's a door casing, window casing, coffered ceiling, and I can see those nail holes, and I can tell that it was just a lack of prep, that's one of the things that just annoys me. One more thing before I let you go and we carry on here. The other thing that I like to have on hand when I'm doing this is just a couple wet paper towels. A lot of times I'll just have a spray bottle with water, just to spray my hands or spray paper towel and get the residue off of my hands. You see just from those, what was that, 6 or 7 nail holes I did, you can see I'm just already covered with that sanding residue on my hands. And then the air compressor, every so often, pretty much every 2 or 3 sections I do, I'll just take out my sander, I'll use the air compressor, and I'll just blow all that stuff off the sander. As you can see, it's all in the crevices, it gets into the motor and the fan and stuff, just keeps my tool clean. We're just about wrapping up here on the crown molding coffered ceiling portion of this part of the project. The last part of the caulking and cosmetic stuff we have to do is caulking our inside corners. Like everything, and I apologize, I know I keep repeating this, but there's more than one method to do this, right? What I'm about to show you has worked right for me over the years, and what I find works best. I'm sure if you watch other channels, other videos, there might be some other ways that might work better for you, but this is what works for me. A quick note on this before I show you my method on how I do it, and I had mentioned kind of a similar theory or concept when I talk about putting up the crown molding. If you have a corner that you know is really good, and you have a corner that you know is really bad, or it's going to be really difficult, well, maybe you tackle the really good one first, right? You tackle the one that you know is going to be easiest, because that's going to help you kind of fine tune and perfect your technique. So if you have a corner that maybe has, a wider gap than you would like to have, or things might be a little uneven, it's going to take a little bit more skill to do, well, save that for last so you can practice on the better ones and figure out your technique as you go. Showing you some of the tools that might benefit you here. 9 out of 10 times, the only tools I will be using are just my finger to wipe the caulk, and then of course the soapy water, and the putty knife blade here. A couple other things I will point out that are helpful from time to time, especially if you're starting out. First one is that bad boy there. It's just a cheapo Amazon Prime caulk tool. And it comes with different noses on it. Some of them you can rotate it around. It comes with like a 4-in-1 head. This one here, I think these little silicone things just pop off. It gives you different angles, different bull nose sizes. So if you have something that you have a wider gap than you really would like, if you take your finger and try and spread that caulk in there, you can have the tendency to actually push that inside and create an indentation. It's just going to look messy. Whereas if you have one of these tools, you can change out the head to the appropriate size, and you can use that on your curved portion, even your straight portion too for that matter, and really follow that contour down. That's something, if you're just starting out, it's a nice tool to have with anything, right? You can use it for bathtub, sinks, get the point. Get rid of that. The other thing is these silicone pieces right here. And a lot of times you can get those kind of 2 for 1 when you buy that caulk tool off of Amazon. And again, they work good for just getting into corners and scraping things down. I have found over time that just the utility knife works better, gives me a little more control. I can adjust the angle a little bit more. And the other thing that I'll use every now and again is just a utility knife. Again, 9 out of 10 times the putty blade will get it done. But once in a while I'll just get a corner that I just can't get the angle right and get my spread right. So sometimes the utility knife blade is just a little bit sharper. I can get in there and do what I need to do. The way we're going to work this is I have 3 flat portions, right? I have this top portion, this middle portion, and then this bottom part underneath where the 2 boards butt together. So I'm going to get caulk in all of those. So what I do is I get my bead going. I'll use the putty knife on the flat portions, scrape those clean. Same thing on the bottom here. And then on my curved profile in the middle and on the bottom, that's when I'll just go back to that, the water and soap on the finger, spread, wipe clean, should be good to go. So don't overthink it. That's really about all there is to it, right? Apply your caulk, do whatever smoothing, spreading method you're going to use, carry on. So as with caulking our longer lines and as with sanding the nail holes, find a happy place. We're going to go and we're going to hit the rest of these corners. And I have one more thing that I have to show you, one more tweak we're going to do on some custom trim work before we end this segment. I'll see you in a minute. One last thing we have to wrap up and crank out before we call it quits on the coffered ceiling section is this area right here. As you can see, it's the outside of one of the boxes that we had built, and there's really nothing on the other side. And it's tough because normally we would fill that out as a full beam, kind of like this one, do crown on each side. But we're kind of limited here with the design because we come up to this wall right here, and then there's nothing here. It just looks unfinished, right? So I mocked up just a few models on some trim work on what we can do here to kind of see what the customer likes best. And really what's going to happen is this is going to kind of be the focal point, right? Well, 2 focal points. The other side is you're coming down the stairs, and then this part here is you're coming up the stairs. So we don't want that to look unfinished. We want some sort of trim work built out there. So what I had done was I just mocked up just a few examples of what we could do with just kind of like a half beam and get a full-size crown molding on, a little bit thicker beam width and some smaller crown molding, and then some kind of built-out crown molding. So just for example, these are some of the things that we had mocked up. Let's see how they would look. And here's an example of So here's one, we did a little bit of a wider beam, but a smaller piece of crown molding. Also doesn't look terribly bad. And this will be an example of something I had referenced earlier during the crown section of how you can just take flat pieces of wood, just throw a miter contour on them, either whether it be an oji or a roundover, and then put a piece of crown molding on just kind of for that 3D effect. Also would look very nice. At the end of the day, when we looked at it, both the customer and myself agreed that we'd rather just go for like a thinner beam, like a half beam width, and keep that full-size crown molding on there. We think that's just going to look a lot better overall. Normally what I would do with this is I would go ahead and I would set my reveal. I would just take the table saw, I would rip down that thinner portion of the beam here, and I would nail that in from each side as we assembled this together, like you saw we did on the other ones. One of the complicating factors here is we already have this finished and set up with the crown on the other side. Our project timeline just would have halted if we were waiting for a decision on what we were going to do here, so I thought it best just to go ahead and continue with the crown molding, and we'd figure it out later. Well, now it's later when we got to figure out. So I can just go through and put nails all the way through that abbreviated beam width section, right? With that being said, I'm very hesitant to put too many nails through there because I don't want to split that wood. So what I did, I actually mocked this up right here. And if you look, you see what's called the pinch dogs here. And I can't remember if we talked about these in an earlier segment or not. I don't know if that cut made it in. I know I used them at one point. What they are is like a U-shaped wedge. They get thicker as you pound them in. So as you pound them in, it takes the boards and it pulls them in close together. So what I did was I just took my beam width here, I ripped that down on the table saw, and I just took this backing board or this support board, glued it on, nailed in my pinch dogs, and you can see, I mean, these are tight. Like I'm reefing on that pretty hard and I can't even get it out. So I pounded my pinch dogs in for some clamping pressure, some really good clamping pressure, and then I went ahead and I nailed down. And when I nailed, I actually nailed it from the top of the support beam, because I don't want to do it from underneath because that's just more nail holes I have to fill. That's one of the reasons I went and I used the glue and the pinch dogs. So bear with me, the pinch dogs are still on there and I still have to cut this down the length. But this way, as we're nailing in this bottom beam section, I don't have to go too crazy with the nails going all the way through the beam into the other beam. I can just go through the support section I nailed onto the back and not worry about splitting my wood. So a couple things I marked out there really quick is I'm just going to take my saw and just notch out some spots for some blocking. I'm going to put some blocking in up top, so when I go to push my other board in, the other side of the beam, I can just push it right in and hit my nails, and everything is going to interlock nice and good together. It'll make sense when I'm doing it, you'll see. Back at it in a new day here. When I put these reinforcement blocks in, I used nails and the construction adhesive. So I wanted to give the construction adhesive overnight to dry and cure into place before I put the next piece of trim up and started putting some stress on that. Now I'm just going to do another layer of construction adhesive on this side and get our other trim board up. This might be a little bit overkill using the construction adhesive on the blocks here, but I don't have any wood framing really to get my trim boards on this side screwed up into the ceiling or nailed up into the ceiling for that matter. So I'm relying on my other trim pieces that I put in to hold everything up here. So the more secure I can make this, the more I want to do. I have a trim board here. I already have my reveal lines marked. And up where the blocking is right here, I just put some mark lines on the ceiling, so when I'm nailing in, I know where that is. This next step is optional, and we could probably get away without doing it, but I know I'm going to sleep a lot better at night if I just go on and do it. And if you watch any of my videos, I tend to overbuild things, and I tend to be overcautious. And what my concern here is we have the trim work here, we're going to have the crown piece that goes on here, and we really don't have a solid joist to drill into up here or to nail into to get things nice and solid and locked in together. All this trim work here is secured to the beams and the other blocking that is just kind of downrange from the room from where we are here. Right up overhead here where we have our trim work, there's no joist overhead where we're actually nailed or screwed into. So I'm relying on my kind of interlocking, blocking, and trim work that's going down the room here that all of this is secure to. I'm confident in that that's going to hold and that it's solid. But with that being said, I don't like not having a securement point at the final end, right? Again, I know it's going to hold, but I would rather have this be solid, especially with that piece of crown there. Over time, as things settle, as vibration kind of might bring things down a little bit, like a 1/16 of an inch, I'd feel better if this was anchored to the ceiling somehow, just a little bit. So what I did was I nailed in our backing piece here that we would do with any other piece of crown molding. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drill through that piece of blocking and just mount a few drywall anchors into the ceiling along the way here. It's probably never going to face any stress, right? Again, I'm confident that everything is secured in here and it's locked in nice and tight, and it would probably never move anyway. But I just want to have those in there just in case down the road something were to happen, right? Like we have some sort of settling of the house one way or the other, some things start to kind of pull down a little bit. They're just drywall anchors, right? They're not going to hold the earth, but it's just a little bit extra that we have in here to keep everything nice and solid and keep our seams nice and tight. Hopefully with the good caulk we're using, that would never be an issue, but you never know. What I did to start this process was I took our backing piece of trim here, our backing piece of wood that we cut down, and I just pin nailed that in place so I can pull it off. And you're going to see why I need to do that in a second. And I have my countersink here, and I have a 6-inch extension. And we're going to need that extension because what's going to happen is if I were to just take the countersink on the drill and try and drill up into that, the chuck to my drill would actually interfere and it's going to wear on the wood. I don't want that to happen. That's where this extension comes into play, right? I love these. This one's made by Diablo. I have a 6-inch one and a 12-inch one. So I always carry a couple of these drill extensions in my toolkit. This one here, this one always stays in my tool belt. That way it's around when I need it. And what I'm going to do here is just in probably 4 spots, I'm going to drill up through our backing piece here and just get a slight countersink in there, and you're going to see why I'm doing that in a second. Part of the reason is to countersink, but the other reason is to have a mark in our ceiling when we pull this piece that we pinned up here off. That way we'll have a nice mark in our ceiling where we can just put our drywall anchors up and we know they're going to correspond with where this board goes. And I just put a little bit of a countersink on those. I'm not so much concerned about recessing the screws so you can't see it, but when you do the countersink, when you snug up screws, it tends to make the wood less apt to splitting. So now we have those countersinks in, we'll just pull our board down. Pin nails make it nice and easy for that to pop off. And now we have pilot holes in the ceiling here that will correspond with those holes that we drilled through that backer piece of wood. And we can just go ahead and put anchors in the ceiling and then screw right through, hold everything in nice and tight. What actually happened there is when I started drilling the drywall anchors into the ceiling, they got about 1/4 of an inch in, and then I was hitting something, the joist. So what probably happened is the stud finder didn't find that just because they were on the corner here and there was a lot of joint compound. It probably just didn't penetrate deep enough to actually detect the joist. But it's all good, right? Because in that prior segment, you now know what to do if there's no joist there. And we're good because there is a joist here. I took a few screws into a few spots here and they were biting pretty good into solid wood. So there probably is just a joist with the framing here. I just couldn't see it on the other side. So we're just gonna pop our piece down here. And I am just going to do a small bead of construction adhesive. Definitely going to be overkill on this. We probably don't need it. We're going to do a fair amount of nails into here, but I have kind of a narrow angle here, and this trim piece is actually a little bit thinner, so I am a little bit worried about splitting depending on the angle it goes in. So I'm just going to do some construction adhesive just for a backup. Here. Don't worry about the pin nails that are around there holding that in place. Those will just bang right in. Now we'll just take our construction screws, we'll drill right up in and reinforce this. And it's all good that we drilled in before, right? That wasn't a wasted step because we did need that little bit of a pilot hole and countersink in there just to make sure our wood doesn't split.
Alright, so we have that final piece of crown molding nailed in. We're going to move on, hit our first round of nail hole filling with the wood filler. We'll get our seams caulked and filled, and then we'll hit that second round of nail hole wood filler, get everything sanded nice and smooth, and we will be ready to go on to paint, which is the next segment in our video series here. Thank you for holding on during this one. This was definitely one of the longer segments we've done, but it was a comprehensive review of the coffered ceiling and crown molding. So if you're doing a crown project, maybe not necessarily just a coffered ceiling, but hopefully this will help you with crown if you just needed something with that. As always, if you could hit those like and subscribe buttons, and if you have questions, hit me up with the comments. I always try and stay on top of those and answer the questions where they come up. I will link the video to the painting up above once it's all set and cut and done, and I will see you next time. Take care.